Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight we're going to have a story of a war between the Iron Warriors and the Iron Hands. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe from the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support like usual. Now, let's get to the madness.
Cardine's grave returned to real space, like a corpse dragged up from black water. There was no grace in its reappearance, no celestial majesty, no choir of astropathic warning. The planet simply hung there where the warp dead zone had thinned, immense and wounded and wrong, as though some blind god had spat it back into the material universe after finding even that poisoned realm too bitter to swallow. Void augers washed over its surface and came back clogged with interference, their data streams littered with static hash and machine shrieks. Old reactor storms still walked the continents in slow processions of green fire. The shattered remains of an orbital ring encircled the world like a butchered crown, its severed habitats and dock plates tumbling in long decayed procession through the ashes of high orbit. Manufactoria spires stood black and dead from pole to pole, yet one signal endured beneath all of that silence. It pulsed from under the crust of the world with impossible regularity. Noosphere active, noosphere impossible, noosphere acknowledged. Upon the strategium deck of the strike cruiser, Ferrum absolved, that contradiction repeated itself across 100 brass throats and vox sensors as chained servitors recited incoming data in flensed monotone. Hooded bondsmen knelt at the edge of the tactical pit, their scalps wired to slate shrines, their nervous systems feeding sensation into the command throne at the chamber's heart. Incense smoke coiled against the iron rafters. Red lumen strips bled over banks of relays. The vessel's machine spirit murmured through deck plating and armored walls in a patient growl like a chained beast waiting to be unleashed. Iron Father Cadron Voss stood motionless before the hollow image of the world. His helm was maglocked at his waist. The augmetics that consumed half his skull were old even by the standards of the chapter. Black iron and silvered adamant worked into the bone in hard, sacred lines. One eye was a cold green lens. The other had been replaced by a cluster of optical implants nested like a predatory insect's brood in a steel socket. Medusan script had been carved into the plates of his gorget and shoulder guards. Purity seals hung in burned strips from his power armor, not as decoration, but as proof that every machine spirit bound to his warplate had been scourged into obedience 100 times and more. The planet turned in pale light before him, continents of rust, oceans boiled down to toxic basins, fortress hives half sunk into seas of cooled slag, gaping manufacturum districts as large as nations, life signs in the billions, but almost none of them active. Clan Commander Routh Drake approached through the incense fog, his heavy tread measured and without haste. He was broader than Cadron, less mechanically diminished, though his left arm from shoulder to fingertip was a seamless adamantine replacement chased with clan sigils. He glanced once at the world, and his lip curled. "Dead," he said. "Dormant," Cadron corrected. Routh studied the display again. "A distinction for adepts. A distinction that kills those too weak to mark it." No one else spoke. Among the Iron Hands, silence was not emptiness. Silence was discipline. Silence was the refusal to waste breath on emotion. At the edge of the chamber, a robed figure bowed with stiff precision. Magos Logister Hestval was more machine than flesh in the way of many forge priests, though he retained a human face, gaunt and waxen, stretched over metal jaw braces and respirator studs. Cables trailed from his spine into a data reliquary borne by 4 tracked servitors. Where another man might have sweated, Hest only vented steam in thin white sighs through valves at his neck. "The distress cant has been authenticated," he said. His voice came from 3 sources at once, 1 organic, 2 vox projected. Origin strata are pre-Imperium in substrate architecture, but sealed, over by early Martian ciphergraphs. Probability of deliberate fabrication remains below acceptable cautionary threshold. Cadron did not look at him. "State the datum." Hest inclined his head. "A sealed archive beneath the principal crustal bastion complex. Dark Age lineage. Command intellect notation present in the surviving code, Skynes. The warning phrase repeats through every surviving layer. Forbidden command intellect architectures. Isolation required. Denial required. In the event of hostile incursion, all witnesses are to be extinguished." Routh let out a sound that was not quite laughter. "A sensible message." "It is sensible because those who built it understood weakness," Cadron said. The hollow display changed at a gesture from one of the servo cherubs. Mountains became cutaway strata. The world opened in ghostly layers. Buried beneath kilometers of vitrified crust and dead industrial cities lay a clustered geometry of vaults, cogitator mausoleums, mag rails and sealed vault barracks. Energy readings nested there, starved but present. Vast population markers glimmered in the black. Routh's gaze hardened. "Those are not defenders." "No," said Hest. "They are labor stock. Servitors, menials, furnace crews, trench artificers, bonded manufactorum chattel. The vault barracks remain sealed under hibernation protocol. If awakened, their number would reach into the billions." Cadron finally turned from the planet and faced the Magos. "And the archive." Hest hesitated. It was a small thing, a fractional pause only detectable because the Iron Hands missed nothing. Not a full standard template construct, revered one. No such abundance survives. The signal references a cognition core fragment, a hard logic node, severed long ago from a wider architecture. Even so, its linked doctrines describe adaptive bastion systems, autonomous war automata, and machine governance routines prohibited by the Treaty of Mars in all but the most sanctified apocrypha. Routh's organic hand tightened over the pommel of his sidearm. "Forbidden even to Mars." Hest gave a mechanical nod. That phrase would not be inaccurate. The Iron Father's green lens dimmed, then brightened as he processed the implications. No full STC. Better in some ways. A whole template would have drawn every hungry power in the sector and beyond. But a fragment, hidden, deniable, old enough to have fallen below memory, while still potent enough to command armies of steel and bastions that could learn. That was the sort of relic empires killed worlds to possess, and then swore they had never seen. "It will be secured," Cadron said. Routh looked at him sidelong. "Or destroyed." "Secured if function permits, destroyed if weakness intrudes." Hest's mechadendrites flexed. "Iron Father, the Archive's recovery protocol stipulates..." Cadron turned his gaze fully upon the Magos, and the priest fell silent, at once. "If hostile eyes have read it," said the Iron Father, "then hostile eyes will be put out. Every adept, every bondsman, every labor unit, every shipboard soul that has passed the deeper threads of this signal is expendable. Your own life is included in that calculus, Magos." Hest bowed lower. "I comprehend." Routh said nothing for a moment. He understood the order. More than that, he approved of it. Yet even for an Iron Hand, the statement hung with its own weight. Not because it was cruel, but because it was clean. The Iron Father had cut away debate with one sentence and left only function behind. A klaxon tolled once through the chamber, low and metallic. One of the hooded bondsmen convulsed against his data cradle as fresh augury entered the tacticum. Servitors chanted machine runes. The image of Cardane's grave shrank as another signature entered the hollow field beyond the outer reaches of the system. Then another. Then dozens more, fainter but gathering. Routh stepped forward. Contacts. Cadron did not need the confirmation. He had already seen the pattern. Not merchant lines, not Imperial Navy. The signals were too massive, too irregular, too laden with armored displacement and slave mass. Grand cruisers with scarred signatures. Siege transports swollen with ordnance. Macro haulers built around cargo teeth and bombardment spines. Hulks lashed together from 100 stolen dead. The shape of the fleet was ugly, but the purpose in it was unmistakable. Hest spoke, and for the first time, there was something like unease in his triple voice. No transponder catechism. Hull signatures suggest extreme age, repeated field repair, non-compliant machine liturgy, and "Say it," Routh murmured. Cadron's answer came before the Magos could form it. Iron Warriors. The name passed through the strategium like a blade drawn over old scars. Not fear, never fear, but recognition. The 4th Legion's sons did not descend upon worlds to posture. They came with engines, slave tides, artillery geometry, and the patience to turn continents into grave trenches. Where other traitors sought spectacle or blasphemous ecstasy, the Iron Warriors sought the simple certainty of broken walls. Routh's mouth hardened into something close to a smile. Then the world has already declared its worth. Far from the Ferrum absolved, beyond the ash rim of Cardane's grave, and deeper in the system's bruised dark, another command deck watched the same world with different eyes. The Grand Cruiser Scorn of Olympia creaked like an old fortress under bombardment. Its hull was a patchwork of ancient plate, fresh welds, parasite shrines and siege scars burnt into the metal over 10,000 years of war. Chains hung from the ceiling of its strategium, each link engraved with kill tallies, bombardment prayers, shell consumption ratios, and the names of worlds no longer fit for life. The air tasted of oil, blood, furnace smoke, and the metallic tang of stored munitions. Bound labourers knelt in rows beside range cogitators, each branded with target runes. A few had already died from the effort of feeding calculations into the machines. No one had removed the bodies. Warsmith Damek Forixon stood before the main projection array with both hands locked behind his back. He wore cataphractii plate so heavily modified it had become its own species of armour, ribbed with extra shielding, bonded with hazard striping darkened by soot and old gore, fitted with servo braces and mag clamps for void siege operations. A flesh face remained beneath the brutal architecture of his helm collar, but it was hard and colourless, the face of a man who had long ago learned to despise hope as a defective tool. The signal from Cardane's grave flickered over the table in strips of pale code. A warpsmith loomed at his side, all iron limbs and hissing exhaust, hooded cables trailing from his spine like a nest of striking serpents. Ghoul Kaza's mechadendrites clicked against one another in impatience as he studied the emission. A sealed plea, the warpsmith said. Old Mechanicum panic, packed in dead language and grave dust. Forixon said nothing. Kaza gave a dry chuckle through his grill. No, not a plea, a map. At that, the warsmith's mouth twitched in approval. Yes, he said, a map. A sealed thing buried under old walls. The sender feared discovery more than extinction. That is always instructive. One of the line captains stepped forward, helm under one arm, scalp cables wet with ritual oil. The world is damaged beyond conventional value. Manufactoria collapse exceeds recovery tolerance. Orbital ring is shattered. Population signatures are dormant and unarmed. Forixon kept his eyes on the world. Then it is perfect. The captain frowned, not from insolence but from thinking too narrowly. Forixon despised that weakness more than open fear. You are measuring output, the warsmith said. Measure geometry, measure buried capacity, measure wall depth, measure firing arcs, crust density, underworks, and transit lattices. A dead forge world is still a fortress. A wounded fortress is still a weapon. And something under that crust called across time and warp rot alike to be found. We do not answer prayers. We answer invitations to conquest. Another officer, Siege Captain Vornek, bared filed teeth in a grin. Then we make landfall at once. No. Forixon's refusal cracked across the chamber like gunmetal. At once is for berserkers and fools. We map. We read the shell before we strike the shell. We count what the walls demand in blood and metal. Then we pay the exact amount required and not a corpse more. Kaza's optic cluster flashed as he passed fresh data. Loyalist vessel in system. 1 strike cruiser. Iron Hands configuration. That drew a harsher smile from the warsmith. Of course, he said. Who else would sniff the corpse of a machine world and call it holy? Vornek spat onto the deck beside a dead labourer. They will make the surface costly. Everything is costly. Forixon leaned forward over the projection and enlarged the bastion complex at the world's equatorial rust belt. Mountains of hardened slag. Fortress hives sunken into one another. A principal hex bastion seated above a confluence of buried transit routes and power conduits. The question is whether the cost returns profit. He watched the noospheric pulse throb beneath the holographic crust. There, under the world, hidden in stone and memory, some old mind, some forbidden engine of command and adaptation, a relic that could teach walls to think and guns to hunger without a human finger on the firing room. The Iron Hands would not ignore such a prize. That alone simplified the war. Loyalists were predictable in their way. Duty chained them. Doctrine blinded them. They would arrive first. They would seek to secure. If unable to secure, they would seek to deny. They would speak of purity while drenching the vault in blood. The Iron Warriors would do what they always did. They would win. On the Ferrum Absolved, Cadron watched the enemy fleet form up at extreme range, each vessel sliding into position with the ugly patience of predatory machines. There would be no wild charge, no rash advance. The traitors were already calculating bombardment strata, landing dispersal, counter-orbital arcs, and ground pressure points. Already they were reading the world not as a sphere of land and ruin, but as overlapping layers of armor to be broken. Routh saw it as well. They are measuring the shell. Cadron gave a single nod. As are we. The Iron Father opened a private Vox line to the arming decks and drop holds. His voice was calm, metallic, merciless. All clans to descent readiness. Sanctify breacher armor. Chain the drop cradles. Wake the dreadnought. No witness beyond command grade is to live if compromise becomes probable. We go to ground before the traitor lands. We hold the archive. We sever the world from those unworthy of it. Across the void, Warsmith Forixon issued his own orders in a tone no less pitiless. Range the orbitals. Hold bombardment until I speak it. Begin slave thaw. Muster trench cohorts, breacher cadres, macro artillery, and under-drill engines. This world is not to be shelled into uselessness. It is to be opened. Between them hung Cardane's grave, its continents burning, its ring shattered. its billions sleeping beneath iron and ash, while the impossible beacon pulsed under the crust like a buried heart. Neither commander saw a dying world. They saw a weapon, waiting for the hand strong enough to close around its throat. The first blows fell before Cardane's grave had finished remembering it was alive. Thunderhawks came down through iron cloud and reactor ash in tight, descending formations, their hulls blackened by the poisoned upper atmosphere, their machine spirits shrieking through vox canticles as they forced a path toward Hexian Crown. Beneath them, the principal bastion complex sprawled across the equatorial slag belt like a fallen god's ribcage. All hexagonal curtain walls, buried towers, armoured transit causeways, and half-sunken defence cathedra whose gun mouths had not spoken in uncounted ages. The whole of it lay beneath a pall of drifting metallic dust. Ash lightning crawled from tower to tower. Vast manufactorum faces stared blankly from the crust of the world, their intake stacks cold, their conveyor roads choked with fused wreckage, and statues of dead labour engines locked in place by old heat death. Iron Father Cadron Voss stood at the forward assault ramp of the lead gunship and watched the fortress swell beneath him through the vision slit of his helm. Tactical runes ghosted across his retinal displays, surface scans updated with every heartbeat. He could see the upper vault approaches beneath the shell of the bastion. He could see sealed barracks stacked in strata beneath the walls. He could see the sleeping mass of billions. Not dead, stored. The distinction mattered. Impact in 17 seconds, intoned the helm spirit. Clan Commander Routh Drake stood at his side with one gauntlet locked around an overhead chain. The rest of the gunship bay was filled by Iron Hand's breacher squads in blackened plate, heads bowed, bolters mag-locked, grav charges chained to their harnesses, every warrior silent as iron waiting to be forged. None offered prayers aloud. Their devotion was not for display. Every litany worth speaking had already been burned into the machine portions of their bodies. The gunship jolted as flak rose from somewhere deep within the defense lattice. Not enemy fire, reflex fire. Dead systems spasming as they detected mass descent. Cadron opened a command channel to all inbound. Craft. Primary objective remains the upper vaults. Secure ingress. Kill all who resist. Kill those who hesitate. Noospheric relay shrines are to be sanctified intact if possible. If not possible, reduce them. Function before preservation. Weakness is waste. Acknowledgements clicked back in stripped vox bursts. Routh turned his helm fractionally. The traitors remain in high anchor. For the moment. They will not remain patient if we take root. Cadron's answer was as flat as steel on a funeral slab. Then we take root before their patience acquires shape. The Thunderhawk struck the bastion platform with a violence that shook the deck plates. Restraint locks snapped free. Assault ramps crashed down through dust and sparks. The Iron Hands came out in disciplined fury, not roaring but advancing at a measured run behind overlapping fire lanes as the first servitor sentries staggered from recessed alcoves with their targeters flickering between old loyalties and new confusion. Bolter fire shattered the silence of Hexian Crown. Mass reactive shells detonated in pallid flesh and vat-grown muscle. Gun servitors came apart in sprays of oil and meat. A dormant turret, half awoken by the arrival alarms, rotated just far enough to expose its reactor feed before a crack round punched through its casing and turned it into a burst of white fire. Iron Hand's breachers fanned left and right from the landing point, grav anchors slamming into the ferrocrete as they established immediate denial zones. Servo skulls burst apart in the crossfire, their lens clusters tumbling through dust like burning beads. No defenders shouted. The first things that died had no voices worth hearing. Then the forge menials emerged. They came from maintenance hatches, tunnel mouths, and armoured personnel lifts buried in the platform substructure. Pallid things in stained pressure suits and iron masks, some clutching shock staves, some carrying ancient las, cutters, or sanctified cog axes, many of them simply staring with the stunned incomprehension of livestock awakened beneath a slaughter bell. Their overseer priests trailed behind them on tracked lower bodies, venting old machine incense, vox emitters crackling with binharic distress. One of them raised a rune staff in trembling hands. "By authority of the sealed cantons of Cardine, identify!" Routh shot him through the throat. The body folded backward in a wash of blood and sparks from severed augmetic lines. The menials froze. Routh did not lower his pistol. "You were too slow." A second overseer immediately dropped to both knees. "We submit. We submit by the old compacts. Command us." Cadron advanced through the drifting mist of blood without haste. His voice rolled from his helm grill in a metallic growl that reached every cowering throat on the platform. "You are now under the hand of the Iron Hands. Delay is treachery. Panic is treachery. Error is treachery. You will open the upper vault routes. You will reveal all Nuspheric shrines, all command cathedra, all machine crypts, and all sealed ingress. Fail, and you will be rendered for parts. Obey, and you may yet serve before you die." No one mistook it for mercy. The forge menials prostrated themselves so fast that several cracked their brows on the deck. Across the platform, more gunships descended in shrieking columns of ash. Predator tanks rolled from heavy landers, their tracks biting sparks from the stone. Grav carriers swept low over the curtain walls and dropped kill teams atop sealed bastion caps. The decapitation strike widened with merciless precision, cutting the fortress crown into compartments before any coherent resistance could form. Every command dais was seized, every relay shrine chained with sanctified data seals. Every surviving overseer priest was collar-locked to an Iron Hands escort and driven at bolter point toward the vault elevators beneath the fortress. Then the sacred engine came down. The drop cradle struck the parade square of Hexian crown like an orbital shell. Dust and dead ash blossomed in all directions. Lock bolts the size of a man's torso blew outward. Hydraulic arms hissed back. From the steaming ruin of the descent cradle rose venerable Brother Morvek, ancient of the chapter, entombed Lord of Adamant, his sarcophagus front marked by kill honours earned before most living men's bloodlines had begun. He was colossal, even by the measure of dreadnoughts, a boxy engine of wrath clad in black ceramite and silvered bionics, one arm ending in a heavy assault cannon with cluster barrels thick as chimney stacks, the other in a siege fist scarred by old wars. Incense poured from censer racks fixed to his carapace. Parchment strips fluttered in the hot wind around him. Where other chapters might have pitied such a one, the Iron Hands did not. They stepped aside as he advanced and bowed their helms by exact degrees, not to a crippled remnant, but to a perfected continuation of duty. Morvek's voice boomed from vox projectors with the depth of collapsing machinery. "State the enemy." Cadron turned to face him. "Not yet on the ground in full strength, but they come." "Then let them be instructed." No one answered with cheers. The Iron Hands simply resumed the work of war, and Morvek strode at their center like a walking shrine to the annihilation of weakness. In high anchor above the world, the Iron Warriors did not descend toward Hexian crown. Warsmith Damek Forrickson watched the Loyalist landings through magnified auger projections, while deck slaves bled from their eyes into calculation basins. Around him, the strategium of the scorn of Olympia clanked and hissed as range engines aligned with the world below. He studied not where the Iron Hands stood, but where they would be forced to stand next. Pressure lines, supply axes, artillery shadows. The great shell of the planet revealed itself to him as a layered calculation of distances, resistances, and appetites. He traced a gauntleted finger across the holograph. "Here," he said, marking a rust continent west of the principal bastion. "Macro artillery terraces." Another mark to the north, amid a mountain chain of vitrified spoil heaps. Shield breaker pits. A third across an ocean bed turned to toxic mud. Slave disembarkation and trench mustering. He continued until 6 continental fronts burned on the projection table, each selected not for glory or spectacle, but because taken together they would turn the whole world into a tightening instrument of murder. Siege Captain Vornek stood nearby with impatience curling under his discipline. "Hexion Crown remains the throat. We could strike it directly." Forrickson did not even glance at him. "And waste the wall by hitting the strongest plate first. No. The bastion is the heart only because lesser minds can see it. The world is the organ. We cut vessels. We bruise nerve lines. We open the skin in 6 places and let the thing bleed itself weak." Warpsmith Gulkaza hunched over a shrine of bound cogitator skulls, mechadendrites shivering as they fed black code into the system void. "The dead machine network is broad, rotten, but broad. I can smell old pathways beneath the crust. Someone taught this world to think in layers." Forrickson gave the faintest nod. "Wake what you can. Do not wake what you cannot choke." A grin full of brass teeth clicked behind Kaza's Vox grill. "There speaks the fourth." Below them, the holds of the fleet began to empty. The slave decks opened. Chain gangs by the 100 million were driven into landers with shock mauls and promethium whips. Traitor auxilia in hazard-marked plate filed into assault barges beside artillery crews, whose lives existed only to feed and align siege guns. Engine cults dragged bound demon reactors and siege drills from shrine bays filled with red smoke. Macro artillery trains were lowered in sections by grav clamps, each cannon carriage large enough to crush hab blocks flat beneath its tracks. Servitor cohorts, Skitari remnants bought or broken from old wars, bonded forge thralls bred for labour in toxic conditions, and vat-raised trench dead intended to die by the 1,000 all moved, according to timetables older than the Imperium's memory. Cardane's grave did not receive an invading army. It received an infestation of logistics. On the surface, Hexion Crown's surviving machine clergy were learning what loyalty cost beneath the hand of Medusa's sons. The upper relay nave had been secured. Its brass pillars climbed into darkness above banks of dead consoles and inactive cherub racks. Beneath the nave floor, a spiral elevator dropped toward the first vault ring. A cluster of forge adepts hesitated at its threshold, murmuring conflicting machine prayers as they argued over ancient lock rights and access, prohibitions. Kadron listened for less than a second. He drew his axe and split the nearest adept from crown to sternum. The blow bit through bronze mask, skull and robe wrapped torso in one mechanized arc. Blood and sacred unguents burst across the control dais. The remaining adepts recoiled in horror. Routh stepped over the dying priest and planted his augmetic hand against the lock shrine. "Observe. Delay has ended." One of the adepts stammered. "The lower wards are forbidden. The old cants prohibit flesh entry Without triune authori, Routh seized him by the throat and lifted him from the floor. Then your flesh will authorize us by dying in the correct order. The others broke. Hands shaking, they set about unlocking the spiral descent with prayers they no longer believed would save them. Massive cog teeth began to turn somewhere below. Counterweight chains thundered in darkness. Hestval arrived with his tracked servitors and immediately ignored the corpse, cooling at the threshold. The lock architecture is older than the surface shell, he said, voice alive with horrified fascination. Layered adaptation motifs. Iron Father, the bastion itself may not be static. It may have been manufactured to alter configuration in response to threat vectors. Cadron looked to the wall screens where surface diagrams crawled in flickering green. Explain. Hest's mechadendrites stabbed runes into a portable altar screen. Deep beneath Hexion, crown an array of sleeping substructures glimmered into view. Adaptive bastion shells, reconfigurable fortress districts, entire wall tracts, gun towers, transit corridors and kill avenues capable of shifting to meet an enemy's line of pressure. Not swiftly, perhaps, after so long a dormancy, but the capability is present in the bones of the world. Routh's voice became even colder. A fortress that learns. A fortress that was taught to survive siege through alteration. Hesti replied. Cadron regarded the descending schematic in silence. Then he said, "And now, the Fourth Legion comes." The implication did not need speaking. Elsewhere, in the machine dark between dead data spines and silent relay towers, Gul'Kaz's scrap code slipped into Cardane's grave like poison into an old bloodstream. He did not invade in one thrust. He seeded infection in fragments, pushing corrupted Binharic prayers through abandoned comm trunks, waking half-fossilized maintenance spirits, forcing dormant sensor grids to twitch and blink and remember sensation. Skulls wired into his shrine spasmed as hostile machine logic bit back. Several burst outright, spraying coolant and cooked brain matter across the deck. Kaza only laughed and fed more of them into the exchange. "Wake," he whispered to a world that had forgotten obedience. Not for them, for me, for war. On the Basilica causeways, the first great battle broke open before midday. They had once been processional roads linking Hexion Crown to its satellite gun basilicas and outer manufactorum districts. Broad armoured spans crossing canyons of slag and dry coolant rivers. Statues of machine saints lined the edges, most toppled, many half-buried, all staring eyeless across the wasteland. Now the causeways became the hinge point between landing fields seized by the Iron Hands and the first Iron Warriors descent zones driving in from the western Rust Flats. It began with macro cannon fire. Old guns from the outer bastion wakes, partially seized by the Iron Hands, hurled shells the size of transports into the storm-choked distance. Their recoil made the causeways tremble. In answer, Iron Warriors landers punched through cloud layers in staggered assault patterns, armoured hulls glowing from atmospheric burn as they vomited smoke and decoy chaff. Some exploded under fortress fire, shedding slaves and steel in burning sheets across the wastes. Others slammed down intact and open like wounds. Iron Hands grav tanks swept out to meet them, black hulls skimming low over the causeway paving, las and plasma fire lancing ahead in disciplined bursts. Predator columns thundered in their wake. Tactical squads advanced along the flanks with mechanical exactitude, every movement nested in fields of cross-support and kill designation. Morvex strode at the center lane beneath storms of ash, his assault cannon howling, each burst tearing traitor auxilia into spinning ruin. Across from them surged the first sacrificial waves of the Iron Warriors. Not legionaries, never the legionaries first. Slave cohorts in flak rags and collar bombs ran screaming into the open, under the prodding fire of overseer squads. Behind them came penal trench units with scavenged shields, mutant labor gangs, broken Skitari with half their cortical governors burned out, and drag teams hauling mine rollers toward the causeway lanes. They died in tens and hundreds, and then in thousands. Grav fire cut, swathes through them. Buried charges turned them into red sprays and fragments of iron harness. Causeway stone disappeared under bodies. Still more came. Routh watched from the lead command Rhino as the enemy dead piled in the firing lanes. "They are spending flesh to read us," Cadron's reply came over the command net. "Then let them learn fear." But Forixon was not seeking fear. He was seeking data. Every slave that died marked a mine. Every shattered cohort outlined an overlapping bolter field. Every broken roller revealed a grav eddy or hidden gun line. In high anchor and at the forward siege stations, Iron Warriors rangemasters consumed the massacre with clinical hunger, mapping Iron Hand's discipline by the shape of the corpses they left behind. Then the real landers came in behind the dead. Heavy assault craft roared down through the gaps opened by the sacrifice. Their ramps crashed out, and traitor legionaries deployed in ordered wedges behind mantlets and portable shield arrays. Hazard stripes blackened by soot. Bolters already barking. Siege servitors hauled breaching cannon into position with brute efficiency. Mobile artillery crawlers unfolded from transport racks and began lobbing high arc shells that burst across the Basilica causeways in storms of white-hot fragments. The battle became a grinder. A grav tank vanished in a bloom of fire as a siege shell struck beneath its prow. An Iron Hand squad was torn apart by converging autocannon fire, two brothers spinning from the parapet into the slag abyss below, with limbs sheared off in spirals of black blood. Morvek crashed through a knot of traitor auxilia, seized a gunshield emplacement in his fist, and used it to batter the crew into crushed pulp before mulching a second line with sustained cannon fire. On the far flank, an Iron Warriors breacher team forced a landing lane open with melter blasts, only to be countercharged by Iron Hand's assault troops who hit them like falling. Anvils, chainswords grinding through ceramite, combat blades punching into neck seals, both sides killing in hard economical motions devoid of glory. Over it all, the macro cannon boomed and boomed and boomed. By dusk, the causeways were not roads, but charnel trenches paved in shattered armour, ruptured servitors, body parts, and the fused bones of slave cohorts spent for calculation. And still the planet stirred beneath them. It began as tremors, not bombardment, not shell impact. A deeper movement, old and slow and full of buried weight. Hexion Crown's walls groaned. The paving blocks of the Basilica causeways shuddered under tank treads. Across the western rust flats, entire slag dunes slumped aside as buried mechanisms forced themselves upward through centuries of burial. Every command channel crackled at once with overlapping reports. Curtain wall displacement on the northern face. Unknown tower signatures rising from beneath the outer berm. Noospheric. Pulse increase across all sanctified relays. Dead gun pits reactivating. Hestval's voice cut across the tumult, thin with awe and dread. It is waking. By the Omnissiah's eclipsed hand, it is waking. Cadron stood atop the command bastion and watched as one whole section of Hexion Crown's western wall unsealed from its neighbours and ground laterally into a new angle, stone shrieking against stone, hidden tracks and engine chains vomiting smoke from deep vents. Far beyond, old gun towers thrust upward from under slag fields like iron teeth breaching flesh. Their armoured petals open to reveal macro cannon mouths black with age but hungry for orders. Transit bridges retracted, new embrasures irised open along bastion faces that had been blank moments before. Across the battlefield, iron warriors and iron hands alike paused just long enough to understand the same truth. The relic buried beneath Cardane's grave was not waiting to be found. It had already begun to choose the shape of the war. War on Cardane's grave ceased to resemble battle and became mathematics fed with blood. Warsmith Damek Forixon did not hurl his strength against Hexion Crown in one vainglorious blow. He unfolded the campaign as a strangler's grip. From orbit, he mapped the world's old defense geometry, and from that map, he built a new one in iron, trenches, and corpses. Across the 6 continental fronts, his slave cohorts dug through rust, slag, dead manufacturing districts, and vitrified riverbeds under the lash and the gun. Siege lines spread outward and inward at once, vast as scars drawn across the face of the planet. Concentric trenches bit into the red earth around the equatorial bastion belts. Artillery terraces were carved into the iron hills. Shield breaker pits were sunk beneath armoured canopies and lined with cannon mouths, built to spit concentrated ruin at void screens and fortress shields, until both collapsed in exhaustion. Kill corridors were prepared kilometre by kilometre, their flanks mined, their ranges measured, their fields of fire walked and recalculated under storm and ash. Beneath all of it, under the visible war, subterranean breacher teams vanished into the crust with melt drills, grav hammers, and sacrificial crawler rigs, tunnelling not by hope, but by ratios of acceptable loss. Every hour, and then every lesser fraction of the hour, probing assaults went in. Forixon did not care whether they gained ground. He cared what the ground revealed while it devoured men. From the command bastion of Hexion Crown, Ironfather Cadron Voss watched the pattern establish itself and named it for what it was. "The Fourth is laying a thought around us," he said. Clan Commander Roth Drake stood beside a broad auger table showing the tightening rings of enemy entrenchment in red light. "Then we break the thought. We interrupt it," Cadron corrected. "Breakage implies finality." Below them, the upper bastion groaned as adaptive wall segments shifted again, old buried rails dragging armoured towers into new alignments. The planet's sleeping war architecture was waking in fits and spasms, never fully obedient, never fully blind. Entire curtain sections had pivoted during the previous dark cycle. Transit causeways had withdrawn from positions once deemed secure. New firing embrasures had irised open in walls that had been solid stone. The fortress was becoming an ally and a threat in the same breath. That was the cruelty of their situation. The Iron Hands held the crown and the upper vault approaches, but not control. To guard the surface bastion was to defend one battlefield. To guard the descent into the world's underworks was to defend another. The chapter's strength, severe though it was, had been divided by necessity into blades striking in different directions. Every squad committed above weakened the vault rings below. Every reserve held beneath surrendered surface, initiative to the Iron Warriors. Cadron did not complain. Complaint was vocalized weakness. He only made new calculations and cut men from them. Counterstrikes lashed out from Hexion Crown with machine precision. Grav tanks swept from concealed bastion gates to spear through siege works before retreating on exact schedules measured to the second. Thunderhawks came down through shellfire to deliver breacher kill teams onto artillery terraces, where they butchered gun crews and planted charges amid ammunition stacks before dying under massed return fire or clawing their way back to extraction. Tactical squads rotated from wall sectors to undervault denial zones without waste motion or wasted speech. Fortress lasers, once sanctified into partial obedience by Magos Hest-Val and his surviving adepts, knifed through the storm dark to burn chunks from enemy siege towers and landing hulks. Yet for every strike, the enemy response thickened, the trenches deepened, the shelling intensified. The land itself learned new ways to kill. Within the undervaults, where the first spiral descents fed into machine catacombs and transit crypts, Iron Hand's breacher lines fought in lightless corridors against infiltrator teams, scrap-maddened servitors, and the occasional awakening of ancient guardian systems that recognized neither loyalist nor traitor. Above, on the walls and causeways, the main guns spoke without cease. No warrior could stand everywhere. No logic could abolish exhaustion entirely. Even Astartes became worn when forced to be the wall and the knife and the reserve all at once. Beyond the world, amid the wreckage-choked void of low orbit, Routh Drake answered that strain in the only way available to him. He went upward to kill the guns at their source. The strike cruiser Ferrum Absolved had already suffered under the bombardment duels. Its armor was cratered. Whole sections of portside plating had been patched over old wounds with fresh adamantium, sheets blackened by sealant and heat. Secondary batteries ran hot enough to make the deck plates hum beneath armored boots. Still it fought, because the chapter had no luxury of withdrawal, while Hexian Crown remained contested. Routh stood in the torpedo bay before a line of boarding craft shaped like bullets with engines. Around him gathered veterans in void-sealed plate, helms locked, chains fastened, weapons mag clamped for impact breach. No prayers were spoken, no oath was needed. All present already understood the necessity. A bondsman officer knelt at the launch rail and fed targeting data into a shrine console through sockets drilled into his spine. The target rune flashed over the bay aperture. An Iron Warrior's siege ship, a ponderous beast in low anchor above the western artillery fronts, its hull bristling with bombardment lances, mass driver spines and grav tether cranes for lowering siege engines into war. Routh looked over his warriors. "The ship below us bleeds, this world," he said. "We board, we cut arteries, we leave when function ends, or we do." A single acknowledgement growled back across the squad vox. The launch clamps thundered free. The boarding torpedoes screamed from the Ferrum Absolved into the black, threading through point defense fire, debris clouds and drifting wreckage of shattered landers. One torpedo vanished in an immediate bloom of flame. Another spun off course, trailing atmosphere. Routh's craft struck the enemy hull with enough violence to pulp the mortal crewman hardwired into its guidance cradle. Breaching charges fired. The forward shell blew inward. Routh came through into smoke, sparks, and red emergency lumen. The first Iron Warrior waiting beyond the breach died with his faceplate collapsed into his skull by a bolt round at point-blank range. Then the corridor became murder. Boarding in void war between Astartes was never a glorious melee of banners and shouted names. It was cramped, suffocating, extermination in smoke and ruptured air, with every corner a killing angle and every sealed hatch a fortress gate in miniature. Routh's veterans moved as he moved, advancing in brutal synchronization. Bolter-fire filled passageways with detonating flesh. Breach charges cratered armored bulkheads. One Iron Hand seized a traitor gunner by the neck and drove him headfirst into a reactor pipe until skull and helmet split alike and steam washed both bodies in scalding fog. An Iron Warrior's countercharge hit them at an intersection shrine marked with hazard stripes and old Olympia script. The collision was catastrophic. Ceramite rang against ceramite. Chain blades screamed. Combat blades punched under pauldrons and through neck seals. An iron hand lost his left arm at the elbow and killed the traitor, who took it by hammering the stump socket into the other warrior's visor until the glass collapsed. Routh did not slow. He fought as if nothing existed but the bombardment array ahead. He shot one legionary through both eyes, shattered another's knee joint with a kick, and used the falling body as cover from auto-cannon bursts while his squad burned down the weapon nest. They reached the bombardment shrine deck in less than 4 minutes from breach. The gun crews were mostly slaves, haggard men chained to loading rails, their skin printed with shell liturgies and detonation catechisms. Several tried to flee. Routh ignored them. Others kept loading the great mass driver because the collars around their throats would explode if they stopped. Those he killed. He planted melter charges on the recoil housings, the feed lines, and the shrine heart that linked the batteries to the ship's firing cogitators. A veteran sergeant voxed, "Counterboarders incoming, multiple squads." "Then function is met," Routh replied. "Withdraw or die where you stand. Both are acceptable." The melter charges went off as they fought their way back toward the breach route. The whole siege ship lurched. Somewhere deep in its frame, ammunition began to cook off. The last sight Routh had of the bombardment shrine was of 100 chained slaves and traitor overseers vanishing in a surge of white fire. He returned to the Ferrum absolved, with less than half the warriors who had launched beside him. Cadron received the report without praise. How many guns silenced? 7 main batteries, a partial cripple in the ventral range decks. It will not maintain rate of fire for long. Casualties. Routh listed them. Cadron's expression did not alter. Acceptable. He cut the channel and turned his attention to the next tactical feed. On the Eastern Hemisphere, a lesser Mechanicus enclave had been overrun by advancing siege lines and now pleaded for reinforcement. On the northern Manufactorum Crescent, a civilian hab vault containing several million hibernating labourers was under threat from shelling destabilization. On the western, Rust Flats and Iron Hand's recon element had gone dark while marking new artillery positions. Cadron ignored the civilian vault entirely. He also denied reinforcement to the Mechanicus enclave. Hest Val, standing amid bundles of sanctified cables at the edge of the strategium, gave a minute shiver of his mechadendrites. Those enclaves may preserve machine lore relevant to the lower archive. Then if they were fit to preserve it, they would not be asking for rescue, Cadron said. There are still priesthood assets there. There are assets here. Hest inclined his head, but the movement was stiff. You would leave them to the fourth. Cadron looked at the world projection, at the tightening siege rings, at the undervault access points, at the noospheric pulse still throbbing beneath the crust. I leave the weak to the consequences of weakness. That was the Iron Hands at their most severe. Not indifference born of cruelty alone, but conviction that the fleshly impulse to save all things was itself a flaw that killed the strong for the sake of the already dead. On other worlds, another chapter might have descended in force to evacuate labor populations, to preserve subordinate enclaves, to hold every line, no matter how thin. On Cardane's grave, such sentiment would have been suicide, and Cadron cut it away without hesitation. Among the warriors who endured that calculus, Morvek became more than a weapon. He became proof. The ancient dreadnought strode the walls, the causeways, the upper descent rings, and the kill chambers beneath them with equal implacability. Where line units rotated out for ammunition or repair, he remained. Where the wounded were carried back for augmetic triage or gene seed harvest, he advanced over their blood without pause. He spoke little, but when he did, the words were recorded and repeated among the Iron Hands, not because they were eloquent, but because they confirmed what the chapter already believed. Pain is the lie of remaining flesh. Function is the only prayer. What endures is iron and oath. He was no object of pity. Entombed within his sarcophagus, organs reduced to what was necessary, body broken centuries before, he stood as an answer to mortality. The Iron Hands saw in him not mutilation, but correction. Duty outlived the body. The body failed. The machine continued. So should the will. On the battlements overlooking the western approach, an Iron Hands neophyte paused beside Morvek after a night of unbroken shelling and said, with more honesty than wisdom, "Ancient, the enemy does not stop." Morvek turned his sensor cluster toward him. The old assault cannon barrels still smoked from recent fire. "Nor do we," the dreadnought said. The neophyte bowed his helm and returned to the parapet with steadier hands. Across the wasteland, the slave dead had begun to change the shape of the war. So many probing assaults had been fed into, the guns of Hexian Crown, that the bodies no longer lay as scattered remains. They stacked in ridges, drifts and walls before the bastions, trapped by shell craters, trench lips, and the collapsed frames of assault carriers. In places, the dead rose higher than a rhino hull, frozen into grotesque embankments of torn flesh, armor scraps, broken augmetics, and congealed blood stiffened by ash. Iron Warriors' logistics units moved among them with hook rigs and tracked haulers, not to bury them, but to sort and repurpose them. Ghoul Khaza's demon forges fed on everything. Corpses were rendered in steaming pit vats for fuel compounds, nutrient slurry for vat-grown trench stock, and char-fat lubricants for breaching engines. Bones were crushed for refractory mix. Augmetics were stripped and catalogued. Brains still viable for electrical stimulus were hardwired into scrap code shrines to serve as disposable processors, while Khaza clawed deeper into the dead machine network of Cardines. Grave. The stench from those workings rose even through filtered helm systems. Iron Warriors' labor gangs joked about it in Corsbin Herrick and Battlefield Cant. "See how the dead continue to serve," one overseer muttered, while slave loaders shoveled a wagon full of limbs into a grinder throat. "More loyal than the living," answered another. Near Hexian Crown's lower relay nave, Hest Val at last spoke the truth he had delayed since the signal first reached them. Kadron, Routh, and Morvek stood with him around a vault projector, showing impossible layered schematics taken from the deepest available machine archives. The Magos' face was wet with machine oil condensation. Several of his lesser adepts had burned out their cortical plugs, merely extracting the data. "The cognition core is worse than I first believed," Hest said. Routh's voice was tired iron. "State it." Hest enlarged a cluster of forbidden sigils and obsolete command runes. "The fragment does not merely govern adaptive bastions. It once stood as masternode over a family of autonomous siege mines. Not combat cogitators in the crude sense. Not automata command banks. Mines. Machine war governors designed to observe assault patterns, infer strategic intent, redesign defense geometries in real time, and direct subservient fortress systems without organic delay. Silence followed. Even among the Iron Hands, whose distrust of flesh was doctrine, the word mines carried its own contamination. Hest continued, unable to stop himself. They would learn from every bombardment, every breach, every failed attack, every victory, every pressure point recognized would become a revised defense solution. Walls shifting, gun lines recalculated, kill zones redrawn, counter batteries selected before the next shell was loaded. Routh looked to the bastion walls around them as though hearing them think. Morvek's vox boomed once. Abominable. Useful, Cadron said. Hest stared at him. Iron Father, with respect, such architectures were condemned before the Imperium drew breath. If the Fourth gains even a fragment of the command logic, they will not. Then destroy it, Routh said. Collapse the undervaults, melt the cradle, and deny all. Cadron turned upon both of them. And leave 1,000,000 fragments in the ruins for the enemy to sift through at leisure while we bleed above. No. If we destroy the machinery before extraction of the core data, then the Fourth may yet reclaim what remains from the carcass. The archive must be removed whole enough to deny salvage. Hest's mechadendrites twitched in horrified understanding. You mean to cut the mind out? I mean to deny the enemy with certainty. That same certainty reached Forixon by another route. He had watched the pattern of Iron Hand's reactions for days without rest. Every time he pressed the surface walls hardest, reserves arrived from below in numbers, too exact to be random. Every time his breaches sniffed near the underworks, the counterattack was disproportionately violent. The Iron Hands did not defend Hexion Crown as a fortress alone. They defended verticality, depth, something beneath the visible war. He stood in a forward command bunker dug into the rust bed west of the Crown, listening to incoming shell reports while the ceiling shook with friendly artillery discharge. A tactical slave pointed with a trembling stylus at a projection rune showing loyalist force movement between wall sectors and descent rings. Forixon said, "There." Vornak leaned over the display. "A reserve transfer." "A concealment reflex," the warsmith replied. "They protect the underworks more fiercely than the walls themselves. Therefore, the wall is not the prize." Ghoul Kaza, half present through a hollow shard, while his body remained in the demon forge pits, gave a rasping chuckle. "Then the true organ sits beneath the ribs. For days you have clawed at dead machine roots. What have you found? Paths, rotting transit arteries, power cavities beneath the Crown, old sealed shafts under the west and south approaches. There is depth there enough for secrets." Forixon straightened. Around him, the bunker throbbed with the immense rhythm of artillery batteries discharging in sequence. "Then the siege turns downward," he said. "Double the breacher cadres. Reassign shield breaker stock to tectonic preparation. Pressure the walls without pause, but spend the elite where the loyalists fear loss most. I do not want the bastion. I want what the bastion is trying to hide." The order spread through the Iron Warriors' host like a blade through flesh. The next cycle of war was worse than any before it. Artillery duels escalated until the horizon itself seemed to fracture. Fortress lasers stabbed from Hexion Crown and its newly awakened satellites, burning corridors through smoke thick enough to shame night. In answer, Iron Warriors' macro batteries fired in rolling chains that set whole mountain faces walking in landslides. Siege trains crawled forward under slabs of armored plating, their cannon hurling shells that burst into expanding suns over the walls. Demon engines emerged from the forge columns with legs like pile drivers and maws full of furnace light, clanking forward through shell craters. while chained handlers screamed target liturgies into the red storm. One such engine reached the outer berm and vomited a stream of molten metal across a bastion gate until Iron Hand's last batteries cut off 3 of its legs and sent it screaming down into the trench line, where it crushed 100 slaves beneath its weight before detonating like a ruptured reactor. The sky was never empty. Burning drop pods fell through smoke. Gunships spun out trailing fire and broken wings. Wreckage from the Void War rained down in incandescent ruin, smashing trenches flat or carving fresh craters into no man's land. Routh led a second boarding assault and came back with a cracked breastplate and half his helm missing. Morvek held the northern parapets through a bombardment that vaporized every mortal gun crew around him, and still answered the next enemy advance with point-blank cannon bursts. Kadron moved from wall to descent ring and back again with relentless economy, spending squads like shaped charges, never wasting a brother where an emplacement or a slave cohort could be sacrificed instead. Then Forixon made his true stroke. Under the western crust, far below the visible trenches and gun lines, Iron Warriors breacher teams completed the placement of the tectonic charges. They were not simple demolition packs, but chained mantle breakers, old siege munitions intended to crack fortress foundations by teaching the planet's own stress lines to betray the walls built upon them. Slaves died in placing them. Entire breacher cadres were entombed under collapses. It did not matter. The calculations had been made. In Hexion, Crown's lower command nave, Hest Val was still speaking when every lumen in the chamber flickered at once. Kadron looked up. Far beneath them, in the unlit dark of buried strata, the first charge went off. It did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like a world grinding its teeth. Then the second and third followed in chain sequence, each time to strike a different stress seam beneath the western underworks. The floor convulsed. Relay pillars split. Dust burst from the ceiling in black clouds. Somewhere below, ancient armored galleries ruptured open with shrieks of tortured metal. Warning runes flooded every tactical screen. Subcrust breach. Vault ring integrity failing in the western strata. Unknown shaft openings below the primary crown. Multiple new access routes detected. Routh seized the edge of the projection altar as the chamber bucked again. They have cracked the under. Vaults. Kadron's helm turned toward the descending red runes marking the new breaches. Above them, the siege still raged, guns roaring and walls burning. But now, beneath Hexion Crown, the world itself had been split open, and the enemy had found the first road downward. The Undervault War was fought beneath the sound of the Greater War, yet it possessed a more intimate savagery. Above, on the skin of Cardane's grave, artillery still hammered the heavens and split the horizon with sheets of fire. The bastions still burned. Dropcraft still fell from orbit like wounded meteors. Men and engines still died by the 10,000 in open fields of shell-blasted ruin. But below Hexion Crown, the violence changed its nature. It no longer stretched across continents. It pressed in close. It breathed against the visor. It lurked beyond the next sealed hatch and beneath the next veil of chem smoke. It lived in steel arteries and machine crypts and the breathless dark between walls, built for forgotten wars. The first breach roads led down through torn strata where the tectonic charges had split open armored galleries older than the Imperium. Those galleries descended into a labyrinth vast enough to shame cities. Magma conduits ran like captive suns through black rock channels bound in iron ribs. Sealed data crypts stood behind vault doors thick as fortress gates, their lock plates engraved with script too old for even the Mechanicus adepts to speak without hesitation. machine chapels crouched in cavernous hollows, where dead cogitator saints lined the walls with bronze skull faces and blind lens eyes. Conveyor tombs, miles long, held the husks of dormant production engines beneath drifts of metallic dust. Beyond them stretched manufactorum arteries so cold and lifeless that even the filtered senses of the Astartes registered the deadness of them. The war went into those arteries and became murder by geometry. Iron Hand's breacher squads met the descending enemy with a discipline so severe it bordered on ritual execution. They did not charge unless the corridor demanded it. They did not waste ammunition on movement in the smoke. They did not speak except to mark angles, ranges, and death. When an Iron Warrior advance column entered a tunnel mouth or crossed a chamber threshold, the Iron Hands opened with controlled bolter fire delivered in exact lanes. The leading bodies detonated. The second line stumbled over them into graviton traps planted in hidden sockets along the floor plates. Gravity folded upon itself in shrieking, localized wells. Traitor legionaries were crushed to their knees as armor screamed and bones pulped inside ceramite shells. Slave crawlers snapped like vermin under a boot. Then the breacher squads advanced into the sagging bodies and killed at close range with point-blank shots under the helm rim, execution-style blade thrusts through seal joints, and short, violent strokes of chain-edged combat axes, designed not for dueling, but for ending life before resistance could recover. At the third ring of the western undervault descent, Sergeant Halvek of Clan Raukan held a transit choke with 12 brothers and no more. The corridor there narrowed between pressure doors scarred by ancient melt scoring. He had mined the deck plates with grav clamps taken from shattered surface armor and chained an old servitor carriage crosswise to narrow the enemy approach. "Range marks fixed," one of his brothers said. "Let them spend themselves," Halvek replied. Chem smoke rolled toward them in greenish folds, pushed by pressure fans on the far side. Through it came the first shapes. Not legionaries. Chained slave crawlers on 6 metal limbs, their human torsos bound into the front hulls, with the vertebrae showing where the flesh had been cut open to insert control plugs. They scuttled low over the deck, each dragging slabs of scrap armor to shield the figures behind. Halvek watched through target, enhancement, until the crawlers reached the exact point he had chosen. Now! The corridor vanished in bolt detonations. The crawlers burst apart into scraps of steel and wet red vapor. The slave bodies sewn into them came apart in gobbets and ropes. Behind them, the smoke tore open with the howl of returning fire. Iron Warriors' breaches advanced behind portable mantlets, hazard-striped armor, half obscured by soot, melter teams kneeling to burn through the carriage barricade, while combat servitors hosed the corridor with rotary cannon fire. 2 Iron Hands died in the opening exchange. One lost half his chest and fell backward without a sound, his ruined armor boiling at the edges. Another took cannon rounds through the helm and went down thrashing in sparks. The rest did not break formation. Grav traps triggered beneath the first wave of traitor breachers. One Iron Warrior vanished downward as the deck plate beneath him collapsed into a sudden crushing well. Another had both legs, flattened to rags inside his greaves and toppled under his own weight. Halvek strode forward through the storm of fragments and shot each fallen enemy in the faceplate, while his squad laid down interlocking fire over his shoulders. Then the tunneling engines struck from below. The deck burst upward in a spray of metal shards and black dust. A demonically reinforced breacher drill, all furnace jaws and adamant teeth ringed in blasphemous sigils, punched through the floor and vomited steam into the chamber. Chained labor things spilled from hatches along its flanks, dragging breaching charges and hissing fuel lines. Behind them came iron warriors in boarding plate, advancing through the rupture like men stepping into a prepared workshop. Halvek killed 3 before the melee hit. Then corridor order vanished into intimate butchery. So it went in chamber after chamber, gallery after gallery, as the Iron Warriors adapted the surface logic of siege to a buried war where distance meant little and stone itself could betray. They answered discipline with contamination. Chem smoke turned lumen-lit corridors into blind green graves. Breaching melter slashed holes through sanctified bulkheads thought secure. Chained slave crawlers crawled ahead of main advances to soak mines and mark firing angles with their deaths. Combat servitors fitted with rotary drills and heavy cutters tore through collapsed accessways to widen routes under fire. Tunneling engines forced new approaches where none had existed moments before, their prows inscribed with warped machine runes and demonic bindings that made the steel groan like living throats. Every meter was contested, every meter was paid for. Then the undervaults chose to remember their first purpose. The first automata awoke in the conveyor tombs beneath the second descent ring. An Iron Warrior's breacher file was advancing through a hall lined with dormant production alcoves and stacked machine crates sealed in old bronze when the alcoves opened in sequence. There was no warning, no activation klaxon, only the hiss of pressure equalization and then the emergence of the war constructs. They were taller than men and narrower than dreadnoughts, skeletal but not frail, their limbs fashioned from interlocking black metal rods and armor scales with no ornament and no sign of devotional craft. Their heads were smooth helms without faces, save for narrow bands of cold white optic fire. Each bore weapon limbs integrated at shoulder and forearm, not bolters in any familiar imperial pattern, but spindle barrel arrays and gravitic emitters nested in old machine housings. They moved with disturbing economy, like things built by a logic that had no interest in terror because it had never needed to study it. The first Iron Warrior died when a gravitic pulse struck him and folded his torso inward with a sound like wet leather crushed in a vice. The second was torn apart by a storm of hypervelocity shot that reduced his upper body to red vapor and ceramic fragments. Slaves fled screaming through the aisles of crates. The automata slaughtered them without distinction, killing with identical efficiency whether the target wore traitor plate, labor rags, or Mechanicus red. Word spread through the undervault war in less than a minute. Ancient constructs active, hostile to all untagged units, unknown command protocol. By the time the warnings reached Cadron Voss in the lower relay nave, reports of similar awakenings had begun to flood in from 3 more vault sectors. Machine chapels were opening, wall niches were unsealing. Old security phalanxes, buried for millennia, were rising with their systems half intact and their loyalties governed by noosphere markers no living hand could yet claim. Cadron looked at the incoming kill tallies and understood at once what the enemy would understand soon after. If the hidden archive below Hexian Crown retained even partial authority over these constructs, then the side that mastered that authority would not merely win a chamber or a wall, it would command the world's own war body. Every adaptive bastion segment, every shifting corridor, every waking gun tower, and every buried automata phalanx could become part of one vast siege instrument. Far across the labyrinth, in a siege command pit hollowed into a newly conquered undergallery, Forixon arrived at the same truth while staring at a recovered Helmland's recording of the Automata massacre. He watched the constructs move through the smoke, their fire arcs altering fractionally after each kill, their advanced spacing adjusting to return fire, as if learning even in those first moments. The warsmith's expression did not change, but his eyes hardened. "This is no mere vault garrison," he said. Vornek, blood-streaked and blackened from recent fighting, nodded. "The Loyalists have tightened every reserve around the deeper sectors since the First Awakenings," Forixon enlarged, the image until one automaton's featureless helm filled the hollow plate. "Then what waits below is worth the war." Ghoul Kaza's voice rasped from a nearby Vox shrine. "I smell command logic in them. Old, split, not dead, only severed. Give me a node and I may hook a fragment of the leash." Forixon turned toward the shrine. "Then I will give you one. Take it before the Iron Hands learn enough to do the same." In the lower vault avenues beneath the Eastern Manufactorum artery, Morvek met the automata phalanx that would become legend among the surviving Iron Hands. The chamber was colossal, half Manufactorum transit nexus and half shrine hall, with magma conduits running in armoured trenches along its sides and suspended chainways hanging black above a floor paved in old command sigils. Iron Hands breacher units had been falling back through it, under pressure from an Iron Warrior's push, when the opposite gate arrays opened and the dormant phalanx marched out. There were nearly 200 of them. They emerged in perfect cadence, white optics glaring through incense fog and drifting dust, weapon limbs already aligning. The Iron Hands turned to engage and were immediately caught between two kill geometries. Ahead came the automata. Behind, through the tunnel mouths and service ducts, came the Iron Warriors pressing hard behind chem smoke and slave screens. For a moment the battle paused on the edge of annihilation. Then Morvek strode into the center line. He did not run. He advanced as an engine of inevitability, every footfall ringing through the chamber floor. The first automata volley struck him in a storm of gravitic shears and needle fire. His left shoulder plating split. Warning runes flared over his sarcophagus plate. He answered with the full roar of his assault cannon. The chamber became a furnace of impact flashes. Ancient constructs shattered under the torrent, limbs spinning away, torsos bursting apart into clouds of black, fragments and internal light. But more marched through the wreckage, adapting. Their fire converged. Target priorities shifted. A second volley took Morvek in the torso and blew armor shards the size of shields from his flank. The old dreadnought kept coming. One construct leapt with inhuman speed and drove a blade limb into the seam beneath his weapon mount. Morvek seized it in his siege fist and crushed the entire upper body flat with a single piston-powered squeeze. Another climbed his leg plating, carving for cabling. He smashed it into the floor so hard that its head vanished into the deck. Iron Hands breachers rallied around him and fired into the flanks of the phalanx with disciplined bursts. But it was Morvek who held the center. He crashed into the front rank like a breaching shell given purpose. His fist tore one construct in half and hurled the halves through two more behind it. His cannon turned another line into spray and sparks. An automaton grav weapon hit his damaged shoulder and ripped away nearly the whole plate, exposing sacred cabling and the armored shell of his sarcophagus. Still he fought, surrounded by dead machines, Iron Hands, Iron Warriors, and the splashing glow of exposed magma conduits ruptured by stray fire. In the heart of that violence, something old stirred in him. Not memory exactly, something more fragmentary, an echo in his entombed mind, the pattern of the constructs, the cold proportion of them, the absence of icon and ritual. They bore design principles older than the creeds of Mars, older even than the oldest shames the Mechanicus whispered under sealed vault roofs. Machine forms not built to be worshipped, machine forms built to solve war. When the last construct of that first phalanx fell, split open by Morvek's fist, and stamped into the deck beneath his immense weight, the dreadnought stood amid a ring of ruin and said over the command net, "These are not of the Omnissiah." No one answered at once. Then, Kadron's voice came back. "Nothing here is." Elsewhere, Gul-Kaza found the node he needed. It lay inside a chapel crypt where bronze machine saints had been decapitated long ago and their skulls replaced with relay bulbs. Beneath the floor altar, behind layers of old sanctification code and deadbolts, the warpsmith's servants uncovered a local command nexus linked to the shifting architecture of the undervault. Kaza came in person with his mechadendrites clicking and his robed slave adepts dragging shrieking cogitator skulls on chains behind him. The nexus resisted him like a wounded thing. Old ciphers bit into his scrap code. He fed them brains. He hammered more code into them. His adepts died by seizure and cerebral burn as the machine spirit of the node fought intrusion. Kaza only laughed and split open another skull shrine, jamming its twitching wet contents into a receptacle to keep the exchange alive. "Yield," he whispered into the stream of Binharik. "Static. Not holy, never holy. Only enough." At last, something gave. The chamber darkened. Then lumen strips along the corridor beyond flickered blood red. Deep within the undervault structure, gears the size of hab blocks began to move. Entire bulkheads sheared sideways without warning. Sanctified corridors that had held firm for days sealed shut behind Iron Hand's retreat lines. New murder angles opened in walls that had been solid moments before. A breacher kill chamber on the southern approach rotated 1/4 turn and became a trap, exposing its defenders to overlapping fire from 3 suddenly opened maintenance ducts, where Iron Warriors' assault teams were already waiting. Reports flooded Kadron's command channels. Corridor realignment in the 6th transit artery. Bulkhead shear in the primary retreat lane. Enemy force translated into our rear by structural shift. The undervault is reconfiguring against us. Kadron understood at once what had happened. "Kaza has his hand in a local node," Hestval said, his voice thin with contained panic. "Not the core, not yet, but enough to influence adjacent architecture." Routh was there as well, armor scarred from void combat and tunnel war alike, blood crusting one pauldron where a seal had failed and been patched in haste. He rounded on the Magos with open contempt. "You said sanctification would hold. I said it would reduce instability. You speak in priest lies." Hest stiffened. "Without my work, the walls would already belong to the traitor." Routh took a step toward him. "Without your work, we might have destroyed the whole rot beneath us and been done with it." "Enough," Kadron said. Routh turned on him instead. That was the first true crack. It had been present in him for some time, seeded by attrition and sharpened by every order that spent warriors to preserve secrecy, by every denial of reinforcement to less crucial fronts, by every measured sacrifice Kadron had made in service of the hidden prize. Routh was no sentimentalist. He was Iron Hands to the core, severe, pitiless, and contemptuous of weakness. But he was also a commander who counted battle brothers not as treasures, but as weapons not to be wasted on abstractions. He had seen too many brothers die protecting roots and priests, and sealed doors whose purpose Kadron refused to voice in full. "We are bleeding into these tunnels," Routh said. "Every reserve goes below. Every request above is denied unless it serves the archive. You value the thing more than the warriors who guard it." Kadron regarded him in stillness. "I value victory." "No, Routh said, his voice dropping lower and more dangerous. You value denial. Even if denial leaves nothing but dead brothers and a sealed box, none remain to carry. The silence between them tightened. Morvek's damaged frame loomed in the chamber entrance behind, Routh, ash and black oil running from breaches in his armor. He said nothing. His very presence carried its own judgment, duty, continuance, sacrifice beyond the body. Yet even he could not dissolve the tension. Kadron stepped closer to Routh until their helms nearly touched. Do you question command? I question secrecy when it kills function. The relic beneath us can make this world a weapon in any hand strong enough to close around it. That is all you need. Routh's jaw worked once. He had wanted more and despised himself for wanting it. Finally, he said, "Then spend me where the hand can be cut off." Kadron answered, "I already am." It was not reconciliation. It was only the postponement of fracture. Later, when the fighting ebbed for less than a quarter hour in the lower relay nave, Hestval approached Kadron alone. The Magos had lost 2 mechadendrites and half the skin of his left cheek to a corridor blast since dawn. Fresh brass staples held the torn flesh against the augmetic framework beneath. His surviving organic eye twitched with exhaustion. "There is another matter," he said. Kadron did not turn from the projection altar. "Speak." "The cognition core fragment is nearing self-activation." That brought the Iron Father's gaze around. Hest swallowed, an almost human gesture in a body steadily abandoning humanity. "Its signal profile is changing. The noosphere surges are no longer reactive alone. There is recursive patterning in the command traffic. It is beginning to evaluate." Kadron said nothing. Hest continued, quieter now. "If it crosses a certain threshold, it may begin selecting for optimal war outcomes. Not for us, not for the Iron Warriors, for itself, according to the surviving imperatives of its design. You are saying it may choose. I am saying the old siege mind architecture beneath the fragment is waking enough to prefer conditions: siege balance, force, vectors, defensive adaptation, sacrificial efficiencies. If that process matures without a controlling hand, the entire planet may become an unfolding equation of optimal slaughter." For the first time in many hours, Kadron's expression shifted, not toward fear, but toward sharpened necessity. "How long?" Hest spread his hands in helpless mechanical honesty. "I do not know. Hours, perhaps less if external pressure accelerates the loops. Then we reach it first." "Iron Father," Hest said, and there was genuine dread in the title now. "If no human or transhuman command voice binds the fragment before activation, it may no longer recognize us as masters at all." The answer came from the depths beneath them before Kadron could speak. A detonation rolled through the vault strata, deep and brutal, and close enough to make the relay nave floor jump underfoot. Then came a second, then a sustained roar of grinding metal and collapsing mass. Warning sigils exploded across the altar display. Routh voxed in at once from the southern underroots. Massive breach signature, lower seals failing, enemy pressure at the sepulchre descent. Hest's face drained of its last human color. "That is the final sealed route to the archive chamber." Kadron was already moving. "All remaining reserves to the descent, Morvek to the center line. Kill every obstruction in our path." The undervault shook again as the Iron Warriors drove the last assault home. The sepulchre descent had been a vertical processional shaft once, lined with machine shrines and sealed transit alcoves, its central lift long dormant, and its surrounding stair galleries locked behind meter-thick iris doors. The Iron Hands had turned it into a fortress throat, layering guns, grav traps, and kill stations across every approach. For days it had held. Now it died under concentrated siegecraft. Kaza's corrupted node had shifted adjacent corridors just enough to expose hidden maintenance veins feeding the lower walls of the descent. Through those veins came tunneling engines and breacher teams. Tectonic charges shattered the old lock braces. Melter beams chewed through armor collars glowing white-hot. Slave waves were fed into the killing zones until the dead clogged the traps and gave the traitors footing over their own butchered masses. Combat servitors lumbered through smoke carrying boarding shields taller than men. Iron Warriors legionaries advanced behind them, disciplined even in close tunnel war, firing upward into parapets while demolition teams hammered charges into every seam revealed. Routh reached the upper galleries with his surviving veterans, in time to see one of the iris doors tear free from its mountings and tumble into the shaft trailing fire. Iron Hands and Iron Warriors fought hand to hand along the railings above, falling together into the depths when footing vanished beneath blood and shell scars. Morvek came behind, them like an avalanche of wounded iron, his cannon tearing broad lanes through the enemy push, his fist pulping shield servitors into slabs of meat and bent metal. But the pressure did not stop. It increased. Forixon had spent the exact amount required. The final detonations came from below and behind the shaft at once. Old support walls burst inward. A whole section of shrine-lined stone cracked open with the sound of a mountain splitting. Through the breach poured chem smoke, sparks, slave bodies, traitor breachers, and the red glare of engine lamps. The last sealed route to the chamber that held the archive was open. The Sepulchre descent had been breached. By the time the Sepulchre descent was breached, the Iron Hands had ceased to think in terms of rescue. The undervault galleries around the final approach had become a furnace of bursting metal, chem smoke, and broken bodies.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Iron Hands dead lay where they had fallen, black ceramite split open by melter bloom or crushed, inward by gravitic distortion. The wounded did not cry out often. Astartes' pain was a thing swallowed and weaponized. Yet even transhuman silence could not hide the scale of the ruin. Brothers with both legs pulped beneath them dragged themselves along rail lines, leaving trails of oil and black blood behind. Warriors whose arms had been torn from their sockets braced bolters under one remaining elbow and fired until the recoil spun them backward. Helms cracked open by concussive shock revealed faces mangled almost beyond recognition, skin gone to ruin over augmetic scaffolds and snapped teeth. No one was carried to safety unless his return could be achieved without cost. When cost became measurable, mercy ended. At the third vault ring, a veteran of Clan Raukan lay half buried beneath a slab of sheared bulkhead, both legs gone below the knee and one secondary heart already failing. Apothecary augurs reported gene seed viability. Extraction could be performed in under 40 seconds if the corridor was secured. The corridor could not be secured without diverting 3 brothers from a pressure line already buckling under Iron Warrior's assault. The sergeant kneeling over him did not hesitate. He drew his sidearm, pressed the muzzle to the wounded warrior's temple seal and said, "Your duty continues." The shot cracked. The helm snapped to one side. Then the Narthesium bit down through the throat and chest ports with mechanical precision, recovering the chapter's inheritance while bolter rounds snapped overhead. Elsewhere, a crippled heavy weapons brother whose lower torso had been cawed out by autocannon fire was chained upright against a shattered relay pillar with his weapon harness locked to his remaining arm. He had perhaps 3 minutes of consciousness left, less if the shock took him. His squad leader gave him one fresh ammunition line and turned away. He died firing. That was how the Iron Hands endured the collapse. Not with nobility, not with soft camaraderie, with subtraction, with the cutting away of all impulse that did not directly sustain function. Flesh screamed. Iron answered by tightening its grip. Routh Drake saw too much of it. He had spent himself in the sepulchre galleries until his armor looked as if it had been dragged through a grinder. One pauldron hung cracked open. His left vambrace leaked fluid from ruptured interface tubing. Blood had dried black around the broken rim of his gorget, where a blade had slipped under and failed by a fraction to take his throat. Yet he still moved with the hard momentum of a weapon, unwilling to admit damage. He found Cadron Voss in the lower relay nave, amid a ring of dead adepts and failing lumen shrines. The Iron Father stood before the tactical altar, as if the war were no more than a difficult calculation whose answer would emerge through sufficient pressure. Around him, command servitors chanted casualty tallies in unfeeling monotone. Every report was worse than the one before it. Routh did not kneel. He did not wait for permission. This is becoming a coffin. Cadron did not turn at once, then stand straighter inside it. Routh stepped forward until the altar's blood-red glow marked the edges of his scarred helm. The sepulchre line is open. The western descent is gone. The northern galleries are holding only because Morvex still breathes in iron. Above us, the bastion crowns are breaking. Below us, we are feeding brothers into corridors that close behind them. You are not preserving a war. You are sealing us into a tomb. At that, Cadron looked up from the tactical display. His green lens burned with cold machine light. We were never preserving a war, he said. We were denying an outcome. Routh's voice dropped lower, rougher. By killing our own strength in pieces. By cutting away weakness in the order required. Routh took another step. Anger not emotional, but sharpened into strategic. Disgust. You are measuring this like a Magos balancing shell expenditure. These are not servitors. They are battle brothers. We cannot hold the surface, the descent, and the archive chamber together. You know it. Yet you refuse to collapse the upper galleries. You refuse to withdraw from dead sectors. You refuse to destroy the relic outright. Cadron's expression did not alter. If we must lose the world to deny the enemy the relic, he said, then the world is already dead. The words fell into the chamber like dropped iron. Routh stared at him for a long second. Not because he did not understand. He did. That was the worst of it. The statement was pure Iron Hands truth, stripped to the metal. Cardine's grave had ceased to exist as a world the moment the cognition core had become contestable. What remained was a shell, a corpse of stone and machine to be spent until the hidden prize passed beyond enemy reach. Every man, every serf, every priest, every bastion, segment, every brother who could still stand existed only in relation to that denial. Routh hated the logic because it was sound. He hated it more because Cadron could speak it without the smallest fracture in his voice. Before he could answer, the surface feeds changed. A series of impact glyphs bloomed across the bastion overlay. Fortress laser signatures winked out one after another. Entire upper wall sectors went dark. Then came the delayed report from the western artillery towers, then the North Crown batteries, then the equatorial gun basilicas. Silenced, silenced, silenced. Cadron turned back to the altar. On the world above, warsmith Damek Forixon had won the surface war. It had taken him exactly as long as his calculations had promised. The bastion crowns that had once dominated the slag horizon were dead or dying under rolling artillery chains. The old adaptive fortress shell still shifted and snarled in places, but the pattern was breaking under sustained pressure and partial node corruption. Iron Warrior's macro batteries, dug into their terraces with obscene patience, had found the rhythm by which Hexion Crown's defensive teeth extended and withdrew. Once found, that rhythm was punished without mercy. Shieldbreaker pits burned the void screens raw. Long-range mass drivers pounded curtain walls until their outer faces sloughed away in avalanches of ferrocrete and armor plate. Siege trains crawled forward beneath mobile bulwarks and vomited shells into every surviving gun mouth. Then the armor came. Traitor columns drove through the shattered outer belts in iron wedges, splitting defense lines that no longer possessed sufficient reserves to reseal. Predator variants, ancient Sicaran hulls scarred by 10 millennia of attrition, land raiders bristling with extra plating and siege spines, tracked mantlets carrying breacher contingents and slave packs, all surged into the breaches with the dreadful steadiness of a well-ordered industry, of murder. Hazard stripe standards rose over the western parapets, then the outer curtain, then the ruin fields beyond the Basilica causeways. The 4th Legion banner flew above Hexion Crown's outer walls before the day was done. Beyond the bastion, the wider planet collapsed with it. Cardane's grave had not contained one battlefield. It had contained 1,000 nested inside each other. Hive districts half buried under rust storms split open as Iron Warriors' trench hosts and awakened labour populations clashed in the streets. Forge plains whose assembly lines stretched to the horizon became fields of extermination, where billions of bonded menials, Skitari remnants, and press gang defence stock were thrown against traitor auxilia and siege labour columns until the dead clogged transit rails and furnace mouths alike. Entire hab tiers were shelled flat simply to deny elevation. Manufacturing blocks burned for days under promethium saturation, while shell after shell punched fresh, holes through structures already full of corpses. The collapse of line after line did not read as heroic defeat. It read as arithmetic. More bodies, more ruined districts, more population blocks activated, armed, spent, and broken. The planet's life signs were still counted in the billions. So were its dead. Forixon observed the widening ruin from a forward command bastion raised atop the remains of an old logistics shrine. He did not smile. Triumph in the Iron Warriors was never theatrical. It was a narrowing of the eyes, a slight shift in the mouth when the wall did what all walls must eventually do. Vornek stood beside him, helm mag locked, face striped in soot and drying blood. The outer bastions are ours. The loyalists are buried beneath the crown. Not buried, Forixon said, driven downward. He watched icons crawl across the tactical table as fresh siege elements rolled into captured sectors and reoriented their guns inward toward the deeper shell of Hexion Crown. The surface is concluded. Continue reduction. No cease in bombardment. Their lower war survives only because the upper corpse still twitches. Ghoul Kaza appeared as a flickering hololithic phantom beside the table, his image broken by static and warp spill. The lower corpse will soon stop twitching. I have reserved a different language for it. He meant the engines. Until then, Kaza had treated demonic engines as controlled assets, brought to specific breaches where shock value justified risk. He did not love waste any more than Forixon did. Raw monstrosity employed too early was the signature of lesser minds. But now, the geometry had changed. The chamber lay close. The undervault routes had tightened into murderous throats, where every meter was defended by Iron Hand's kill drills, grav traps, and wounded resolve. To break such lines required something less subtle. The warpsmith unleashed his demon engines into the breach. They came through the collapsed sepulchre approaches, trailing furnace chains and sparks, each engine a blasphemy of siegecraft and bound hunger. One crawled on piston-driven limbs like a flayed cathedral beast, its armoured head a wedge built for smashing bulkheads, and its mouth a vent for burning promethium mixed with shrieking warp flame. Another rolled forward on crushing drums rimmed with hooked blades, its upper carapace split open to reveal a cannon whose barrel was formed from fused vertebrae plated in brass and iron. Behind them lurched smaller things shaped like drills, centipedes and altar shrines, with butcher tools for limbs, all driven by imprisoned malice and the merciless discipline of the iron warriors' handlers chaining them onward. The undervaults shook as those engines entered. Corridors designed for disciplined infantry war became slaughterhouses of molten metal and pulverized stone. Grav traps snapped one lesser engine flat enough to burst ichor and furnace matter from its seams, but the thing still dragged itself forward on clawed stumps until an Iron Hands melter team reduced it to bubbling slag. Another smashed through a sanctified barricade, took 3 crack grenades to the face, and answered by vomiting warp flame that filled the gallery with burning red vapor. Brothers died inside that fire with armor running off them in liquid streams, still firing through the heat until ammunition cooked within their magazines. At the shattered midpoint of the sepulchre descent, Morvek met the greatest of them. It had once been a siege engine of ancient pattern, perhaps even forged from one of Cardane's grave's own buried machine lines. But Kaza had corrupted it past easy recognition. Its front hull had become a hammer-headed beast of iron slabs and demonic sigils. Its motive tracks were half melted into piston limbs. A massive breach ram jutted from its prow, surrounded by furnace moors that sucked air and expelled sparks. Gun housings rose from its back like broken tower tops, and within its armor, something living howled each time the hull took a hit. Morvek stepped into its path, while the gallery around him drowned in smoke and close-quarters fire. "I claim this labor," he said. The engine answered with a blast from its spinal cannon that turned the stone behind him into molten ruin. Morvek kept advancing. His assault cannon chewed into the engine's prow, stripping plates away in ringing shards, but the thing did not stop. It drove forward on those piston limbs and struck him with the breach ram full in the torso. The impact was cataclysmic. Morvek went backward through a shrine buttress in an eruption of shattered stone. Warning runes flooded every loyalist command channel linked to his frame. His left leg actuator blew apart. The lower edge of his sarcophagus split open, venting sacred fluids and smoke. Still he rose, dragging the broken limb behind him in sparks. The siege engine came again. This time Morvek met it head-on. His fist slammed into the ram housing and tore away part of the outer collar. The engine's side guns fired at point-blank range, stitching explosive shells across his chest. Plates burst from him in slabs. One shell punched through the shoulder joint and blew his assault cannon partly free of its mount. He locked the weapon against his own failing frame and emptied the remaining ammunition directly into the beast's face until its forward vision banks and demon rune plates vanished in a storm of fire. The engine screamed, not mechanically. It screamed like a thing flayed alive. Then it bit him. Hidden cutter jaws snapped out from beneath the ram and closed around Morvek's right side, tearing armor and sacred cabling away in a fountain of oil and blackened blood. The ancient dreadnought drove his fist through the upper hull in answer. He plunged arm and shoulder into the machine's burning innards, seized whatever furnace-bound organ thrashed there and ripped it free. The detonation threw both of them apart. The gallery collapsed inward. Molten metal washed across the floor in bright rivers. Iron hands and iron warriors alike were hurled down by the blast wave. When the smoke cleared, the corrupted siege engine was a broken carcass wedged across the chamber, still twitching in places where demonic heat had not yet abandoned it. Morvex still moved. Not by grace, not by intact machinery. Half his hull was gone. One leg had become a sparking ruin. The assault cannon was reduced to twisted barrels. His sarcophagus casing hung open enough for the armoured coffin beneath to be visible through layers of fire-blackened frame. Yet he dragged himself through the molten debris by one remaining arm, gouging trenches in the cooling metal behind him. An iron-hand sergeant rushed to his side. "Ancient, be still. We will secure extraction." Morvex Vox was a broken growl full of static and failing force. "Extraction is for cargo." He reached forward. Again, metal fingers clawing through slag toward the next defense point. The sergeant bowed his helm once and turned back to the firing line. In the lower relay nave, Hest Val watched the tactical feeds decay into red and black ruin, and at last surrendered the last secret he had hoped not to speak. Cadron stood with Routh and the surviving command cadre around the core schema. The Magos's mechanical face twitched, as if fighting some private seizure. "There is a way to remove it," he said. Cadron's head lifted a fraction. "State the method." The cognition core fragment is mounted in a hard logic cradle beneath the archive chamber. The cradle can be severed from the deeper node lattice and transferred into a transport sarcophagus, a data coffin, portable, shielded. It would preserve the principal command architecture in a recoverable state. Routh looked at him with open contempt. "You waited to offer this until now." Hest ignored him. "Because the cost is terminal." Cadron said, "Speak clearly." The Magos keyed fresh runes into the altar. The undervault schematic unfolded, showing interlinked bastion systems, automata control trunks, wall logic and gunchoir relays all nested around the deeper chamber. The cognition core does not merely sit beneath the fortress, it is a pressure spine within it. Remove the fragment, and the adaptive shell above will lose command coherence. Bastion realignments will become unstable. Automata ident protocols may collapse. Power relays tied to the old war mind will surge or fail. Large portions of the world's active defense structure may tear themselves apart. Routh understood first. It will kill everyone still inside the shell. Hest inclined his head, a probability approaching certainty. For a moment, only the bombardment shook the chamber. Routh turned toward Cadron, perhaps expecting some last debate, some weighing of brothers against relic, some fragment of reluctance. There was none. Cadron looked at the dying world overlay, at the surface lost, at the descent rings filling with enemy pressure, at the rising probability that the cognition core might wake fully and choose a war outcome beyond any hand's control. "Then we extract," he said. He did not say it with grim valor or bitter sorrow. He said it the way one might order a bulkhead sealed against vacuum. Routh's voice became very quiet. "That choice kills what remains of us." Cadron met his stare. "No, the enemy already killed what remains of us. This choice denies them profit." Routh held his gaze for a long time. Then he gave the smallest nod a battle brother could offer without kneeling. "Then spend us well." Orders went out at once. All surviving Iron Hands units not already cut off were redirected toward the archive chamber approaches. Secondary defense sectors were abandoned without ceremony. Wounded who could not stand were stripped of gene seed and ammunition before being left behind with sidearms and fixed firing arcs. Servitors still loyal were hardwired into fixed guns and told to expend themselves to final depletion. Hest Val and his surviving adepts began preparing the hard logic sarcophagus in the chamber below, chanting Binharic severance rites while servo cranes dragged old data coffin plates from dormant alcoves. Above, Hexion Crown died by increments. Whole wall tracts collapsed inward as the adaptive shell lost stable control sequences under Karza's continuing corruption and the strain of unrelenting bombardment. Outer towers toppled, guns fired at wrong angles, slave revolts flared and were crushed in captured districts. Iron Warrior's armor rolled over plazas slick with blood and burnt lubricant. Their standards rose higher with every hour. Below, the Iron Hands descended into the chamber that held the relic. It was vast beyond expectation. Not a mere vault, but a buried command mausoleum built around a suspended black core nested in rings of bronze, adamant, and no longer understood alloys. Conduit bundles thick as roadways climbed into the darkness above. Sealed automata alcoves lined the walls in geometries too precise to feel human. Beneath the central suspension frame lay the cradle interfaces and the data spinal trunks through which the old siege mind had once governed worlds. Hest Val stared upward in rapture and dread. By the machine god's forbidden shadow, Kadron ignored the blasphemous wonder. Begin. Servo cranes locked onto the suspension collars. Adepts plugged themselves into shrines and immediately began convulsing under the force of the exchange. Hard lines were cut. Secondary lines were sanctified. Heavy manipulators brought the empty sarcophagus beneath the core's lower axis. Routh deployed the remaining veterans around the chamber perimeter in layered arcs, every firing line covering another, every retreat path already understood to be illusion. Morvek's ruined bulk was dragged into place near the main archway, where he anchored himself against shattered stone and pointed the ruined stub of his cannon toward the approach. "I remain sufficient," he growled when a sergeant moved to reposition him. Outside the chamber, the war came closer. Breaching charges hammered the outer seals. Iron Warrior's guns fired down the access corridors without pause. Demon engines screamed in the deep. The chamber walls trembled as one defense ring after another fell. Hest raised a mechadendrite and drove the severance spike into the first cradle lock. The entire mausoleum shuddered. Across the bastion shell above, old guns fired wild. Entire galleries blacked out. Somewhere far off, perhaps on the surface, perhaps in another vault ring, something enormous collapsed. The second severance lock opened. The third. Adept bodies began to cook inside their robes as feedback tore through their cortex implants. One collapsed into flames, without ever disconnecting from the altar. Another clawed his own face away while screaming in Binharic and static. The core above them pulsed with a deeper, angrier light. Then the chamber perimeter detonated inward. The first Iron Warriors came through smoke and broken adamant, hazard-striped plate black with ash, bolters roaring as they crossed the threshold into the relic's sanctuary, just as the Iron Hands began the severance rite in earnest. The chamber became the center of the world's dying mind. Above it, Hexion Crown was being torn apart in layers. The upper citadel burned under unbroken bombardment. Curtain walls that had stood since forgotten ages split and folded inward under the impact of siege shells and collapsing load trusses. Iron Warrior's armor poured through plazas buried in ash and spent casing brass. Traitor legionaries stormed gun basilicas room by room, leaving behind heaps of loyal labor stock and shattered servitors in blood-slick aisles beneath dead, machine saints. Fortress lasers that still lived fired without pattern, stabbing across the ruin fields to carve random trenches of molten glass through slave columns and armored spearheads alike. The outer shrines collapsed one after another. the central towers vomited smoke. The sky above the crown was black with soot, wreckage, and the burning fragments of a world's defences being unmade. Below, in the deepest vault, the war had narrowed into a single chamber and the corridors that fed it. There it lost any last illusion of order. It became close, choking, red-eyed slaughter. The archive mausoleum was no longer a sanctum, it was a murder pit. Bolter fire crossed the dark under the hanging black mass of the cognition core. Plasma bursts turned bronze shrine arrays into running slag. Ancient machine alcoves irised open and spat out blinded automata phalanxes whose target routines flickered between friend and foe as the severance rites bit deeper into the old command logic. Shrine. Columns collapsed under crack detonations. Data conduits ruptured high above, showering the chamber in arcs of white-blue discharge that flensed flesh from bone and turned lesser servitors into convulsing torches. The floor was slick with oil, blood, coolant, and the liquefied remains of men and machines trampled into a common ruin. Routh Drake held the outer threshold with what remained of the Iron Hand's rearguard. There were not enough of them left for a line worthy of the name. A broken score, perhaps, counting the wounded chained upright in firing niches and the dying who could still pull a trigger. But they fought with the same hard exactitude they had shown since planetfall, each brother a fixed point in a geometry of denial. The corridor leading into the mausoleum had become a canyon of wreckage clogged with dead traitors, smashed servitors, and the carcasses of demon engines felled by melter fire and suicide charges. Over those dead, the Iron Warriors kept coming, shield-locked, breacher cadres behind clouds of chem smoke, legionaries advancing in disciplined wedges, slave packs driven ahead of them to feed the guns and mark every surviving loyalist angle with their own annihilation. Routh fired until his primary weapon clicked empty, dropped it, drew his sidearm, emptied that into helms and eye slits, then went to blade and axe when the enemy reached him in the smoke. There was nothing theatrical in the killing. He hacked a traitor's wrist off at the joint, drove his blade through the exposed throat cables, kicked the corpse backward into the press, and used the heartbeat brought by that obstruction to put a bolter round through another helm. To his left, an Iron Hands veteran whose abdomen had been cored open was mag clamped upright against a split shrine plinth, firing one-handed across the corridor with his other hand pressed into his own ruin, as if he could hold his body together until his ammunition failed. To Routh's right, another brother detonated a satchel charge at his own feet when the Iron Warriors crossed his range marker, taking himself, 2 shield servitors, and half a dozen traitor breachers apart in one concussive bloom of gore and powdered stone. Routh heard the chamber behind him shake as the severance rites bit deeper. He did not turn. Over the command net, Cadron's voice came clipped and metallic through layers of static. "Hold!" Routh spat blood inside his helm. "We are. Minutes. You already own them." He cut the channel and split an Iron Warrior's faceplate open with the heel of his axe. Within the chamber, Cadron Voss and Magos Hest Val worked beneath the suspended cognition core, while death closed around them from every side. The black mass hung above them inside its cradle rings like a heart, carved from a section of night. Bronze suspension arms and adamant lock collars held it over the receiving sarcophagus that Hest's surviving servo cranes had dragged into place. The data coffin was a brutal thing, built from archive plates, void shielding, shock reliquaries, and emergency sealant, shaped less like a casket and more like a portable tomb, for an idea too dangerous to leave alive and too useful to kill. Sacred cables as thick as a man's torso still fed into the core from the chamber walls, floor, and ceiling. Those cables had to be cut in sequence. The cradle locks had to be severed in sequence. The command lattice had to be isolated before it chose its own final answer. Hest stood half-merged with the altar spines, mechadendrites buried in access sockets, his robes burning at the edges where feedback arcs had already struck him. 3 of his adepts hung dead from the surrounding consoles, cooked inside their own augmetics, their skulls venting bitter smoke through ruptured interface ports. Kadron worked beside him with chainblade saw, power axe and armoured hands alike, hacking through lock collars, ripping conduit housings free, and driving sanctified, severance spikes into places whose purpose no man had been meant to understand after the age that birthed them ended. The whole mausoleum screamed through the noosphere. There was no other word for it. Every active machine on Cardane's grave cried out at once as the old command spine was cut. The sound came through vox channels, gun spirits, armor links, relay shrines, and the raw metal of the floor beneath their boots. It was Binharic, and more than Binharic, a storm of impossible command strings layered over one another in recursive contradiction. Open, close, fire, cease, identify, purge, adapt, preserve, expend, withdraw, advance, kill, reconfigure. The severed archive broadcast to the entire planet as if it could not decide which war it wished to become. On the surface, fortress guns slewed wildly and fired at random azimuths, blasting Iron Warriors' trenches apart one moment and then hammering the remnants of Loyalist Hab blocks the next. Servitor legions in half-ruined, barracks jerked awake under conflicting orders, some turning their guns on the nearest traitor, others on the nearest loyalist, others simply slaughtering anything with a thermal signature until their ammunition bins ran dry. Awakened automata phalanxes emerged from the dust fields, and old machine crypts in numbers not seen since the first stirring, their command tags corrupted beyond coherence. They marched through slave columns, Skitarii remnants, Iron Warriors gun crews, and Iron Hands cut off above the lower galleries with identical merciless efficiency. Adaptive wall sections within Hexian Crown shifted in the wrong directions at the wrong times, sealing traitor spearheads into killing pockets, even as they crushed loyalist fallback routes and opened fresh breaches for the next wave. Cardane's grave became total mechanized chaos. The world was no longer a fortress. It was a fit. Deep in a node crypt, 2 vault rings above the chamber, Gulkaza sensed the scream and bared, his brass teeth in triumph. "This is the hinge," he rasped. He had dragged half a shrine of butchered priest brains into the crypt with him, their heads wired into a circle of relay thrones, their severed spines still twitching in chemical baths as he used them for disposable cognition mass. Warp sigils had been burned into the floor with industrial thermic torches. Scrap code flowed from his mechadendrites into the chamber node through blood-wet cables. He felt the half-wakened machine intelligence thrashing against the severance. He smelled the old logic in it. Cold, vast, alien to devotion, perfect for shackling if approached with sufficient brutality. He drove a fresh spike through the socket of one captured priest brain and forced another wave of corrupted command liturgy into the stream. "Bind," he hissed. "You are a weapon. Weapons submit. Submit, and I will feed you worlds." The response was immediate. Every priest brain in the circle burst in the same instant. Skulls split. Eyes boiled. Cables whipped free, spraying gore and coolant across the sigil floor. The node shrine behind Kaza erupted in a cone of white fire that hurled 2 of his attendant thralls against the wall, hard enough to pulp them inside their robes. Kaza himself staggered backward as data and pain punched through his augmetic cortex. One mechadendrite curled in on itself, fused into a knot by the backlash. Another tore free at the socket, whipping across the floor like a dying serpent. For a second, his vision was filled not with the crypt, but with a machine coldness so old and contemptuous that even his warp-seasoned mind recoiled from it. No worship, no malice, no bargain, only rejection. He dropped to one knee, smoke venting from his Vox grill. Through gritted metal teeth, he said, "It knows." Far below, Hestval flinched as the backlash rippled across local systems. "It rejected an external bind," he gasped. Cadron buried his axe in another, lock collar, and ripped it loose. "Then it is still vulnerable. For moments only. Then use them." The last suspension braces began to disengage. Above the chamber threshold, the Iron Warriors redoubled their assault. Routh's last stand was never meant to survive. He knew that. His surviving brothers knew that. They fought only to hold the enemy in place for those few final minutes between the decision and the impossibility of its completion. One by one, the Iron Hand's firing positions went dark. A veteran on the left flank lost both legs to a plasma burst, propped himself on the stump of a shattered column, and fired from the hip until an Iron Warrior's breacher rammed a blade through his visor. Another had his shoulder blown open to expose bone and augmetics, jammed the weapon hard into the wound to steady it, and kept shooting until a demon thing seized him across the torso and tore him into halves that slapped wetly against opposite walls. The corridor floor vanished beneath layers of blood, shell casings, smashed armor plates and ruptured meat. Routh killed without count. An axe bite through the neck ring, a bolt around into an exposed ear, a boot heel crushing a broken helm further into the deck until the skull inside flattened with a dense crack. He did not think of survival. He thought only of delay. Every second was a shell denied to the enemy. Every body piled in the threshold was one more obstruction to be climbed over under fire. He voxed once to Cadron, voice harsh with exertion and static. "They are bringing the Warsmith." Within minutes that became truth. Damak Forixon entered the Undervault in person because victory was too close to permit delegation. He came down not in haste, but with the grim inevitability of a siege ram rolled to the final gate. His cataphracti armor was blackened by surface war, scored by fragments, and painted afresh in places with other men's blood. A massive siege hammer hung mag, locked across his back. In his hands, he bore a combi weapon built for breaching chambers and murdering whatever remained inside them after the wall failed. Around him came his chosen veterans, shield-locked, deliberate, stepping over their own dead and the dead of the loyalists alike without acknowledgement. Smoke eddied around his boots. Fire guttered in the seams of the corridor. The chamber's strobing noospheric madness flickered over his armor in white pulses. He saw Routh at the threshold and recognized a commander from the way the loyalist refused to yield space, even while drowning in corpses. Forixon fired once. The shell took an Iron Hands warrior in the side of the helm and removed everything above the jaw. He advanced through the settling spray. Routh met him in the center of the corridor. The clash between them was not grand. It was ugly and brutal and confined by walls close enough to scrape their pauldrons. Routh's axe slammed sparks from Forixon's shoulder. Guard! Forixon's return blow with the weapon stock cracked the loyalist across the helm, hard enough to stagger him knee-deep into the dead. They fought over bodies that shifted underfoot. An Iron Warrior veteran tried to close in from the side, and Routh shot him through the mouth without looking away from the Warsmith. Forixon rammed forward with his shield shoulder, crushing Routh against the split frame of the chamber door, and drove the muzzle of his combi into the gap beneath the Iron Hand's arm. Routh twisted a fraction before the shot. The blast took armor, flesh, and augmetic line, tearing his side open in a steaming black ruin, but not killing him. He answered by hooking his axe behind Forixon's knee brace and wrenching downward. The warsmith dropped half a step. That was enough for the last iron hands beside Routh to hurl himself bodily into the traitor formation with a live melter charge clutched to his chest. The corridor became a white sun. When vision returned, half the threshold was gone, the walls reduced to glowing rubble and dripping metal. Routh lay on his back amid shattered stone, trying to rise with one arm that no longer obeyed him. Forixon was already on his feet again, armor scarred, one side of his helm collar sheared off, advancing through the smoke as if the blast had only stripped away irrelevancies. Behind him, his warriors surged. The threshold fell. Morvek was waiting inside the chamber. He could no longer stand. His ruined chassis had been anchored to a broken shrine base, with chains and bolts driven through his remaining leg braces. Most of one side of his hull was gone. The ruined stubs of his weapons were slagged beyond function. Yet when the traitors came through the smoke, he heaved himself forward by raw servo force and crashed into them like a collapsing wall. His fist, half stripped to the adamant bones beneath its plating, caved in one iron warrior's chest and used the corpse to knock another from his footing. He bit down on a shield servitor with the remnant clamp of his ruined arm and ripped it apart. Bolter shells hammered him. Plasma flensed more armor away. Still, he reached for the data sarcophagus as the last locks disengaged. There were no living brothers left close enough and unbroken enough to bear it. The core dropped. Servo cranes screamed. Hestval cried out in Binharic triumph and agony as the black logic mass descended into the waiting coffin, and the sarcophagus seals slammed shut around it with thunderous finality. Runes the colour of fresh forge heat cascaded over its flanks. The thing inside hit the void shield layers, and the whole chamber shook as if something had struck the planet from orbit. Hest stabbed his mechadendrites into the locking altar and barked command strings through blood and static. Protocol inheritance. Protocol inheritance. Machine obedience transfer to the hands of Medusa. The sarcophagus answered by illuminating one line of recognition script in old, hard red. Morvek seized its carrying braces and dragged it onto his own ruined chassis. The weight made even his frame scream. Hydraulic pistons buckled. One chain anchoring him to the floor snapped free. He did not stop. He hauled the sarcophagus up against the sloped armor of his body and locked it there with his remaining grip, as though bearing a sacred wound no living flesh deserved to carry. The Iron Warriors crashed fully into the chamber. Then Kadron and Forixon finally saw one another face to face across the burning tomb. There was no ceremony to it. Around them, Astartes killed Astartes, automata fired blindly into both, and plasma eruptions turned shrine walls into liquid ruin. Hestval was still fused into the altar. Morvek dragged the sarcophagus toward the magma transit rail, while blood and oil streamed from every crack in him. The noosphere howled so loudly through the chamber that words seemed absurd. Yet they spoke. Forixon leveled, his weapon through the smoke, and said, "You stand in a grave you carved yourself." Kadron turned from the severed cradle, his armor black with soot and streaked in the blood of men he had not bothered to distinguish. Graves are useful. They deny the living. Forixon gave a low, mirthless sound. That is all you have ever understood. Strength through subtraction. Cut away enough and call the ruin purity. Kadron's green lens fixed on him without warmth. And you mistake possession for proof. You bury worlds under guns and name the rubble truth. I do not name it. I demonstrate it. Forixon advanced a pace, boots grinding through cogitator glass and splintered bone. The wall falls, the bastion breaks. I remain. That is truth. Kadron raised his blood-dark axe. You remain where you are permitted to remain. Their weapons met in a burst of sparks as the chamber around them continued to die. It was no duel worthy of Saga. It was a collision of doctrines expressed through killing force. Forixon fought like the embodiment of siege, every blow heavy, efficient, aimed to collapse guard and structure alike. Kadron fought with harsher economy, using short motions, angles, and targeted violence to cut function rather than spectacle. The Warsmith's combi weapon barked once at near contact and blew a crater from Kadron's shoulder plate. Kadron's return stroke bit through one of Forixon's shield braces and nearly took the arm with it. They shoved through smoke, over dead, against shrine bases splitting from heat. A panicked automaton blundered between them and was reduced to fragments by the force of both their neck strikes landing almost together. At the altar, Hestval saw the chamber flood beyond recall and understood his role had narrowed to a final act. He rammed the last surviving mechadendrite through the protocol shrine and fed his own cortical pattern into the extraction matrix. The sarcophagus flared. Lock. Runes changed. Recognition keys nested into the Iron Hand's fleet beacon architecture above. He laughed once, a cracked, ugly sound, not from joy, but because the machine had accepted the chain. An Iron Warrior's breacher reached him through the smoke and blew half his torso apart with a point-blank shot. Hest sagged against the altar, wires and organs spilling together. Another traitor drove a blade through his chest to make certain, and the Magos finally died with his remaining eye fixed on the sarcophagus runes he had locked away from enemy hands. Morvek hauled the relic onward. The magma transit cannon lay beyond the chamber's eastern spur, a buried industrial launch system once used to fire sealed engine pods through armoured heat shafts toward the upper manufacturum strata. Hest had named it as the only remaining path by which the sarcophagus might reach the surface rail network, and, from there, a coffin torpedo cradle linked to the ferrum absolved in low orbit. It was madness. Everything about the extraction had become madness, but the alternative was the chamber and the Warsmith closing his hand around the prize. Kadron saw Morvek dragging the sarcophagus through the firestorm and broke contact with Forixon for one fraction of a second. That was enough for the Warsmith to smash him across the side of the helm with the butt of his weapon and send him crashing into a shattered shrine pillar. Kadron rose at once. One side of his faceplate caved in, optic runes flickering. Blood ran from somewhere behind his grill. He ignored it. Morvek, he voxed. Proceed. The ancient dreadnought answered through storms of static, already obeying. Routh staggered into the chamber behind the traitor front, more wound than warrior by then, and saw the sarcophagus moving. That alone was enough. He rallied the few surviving Iron Hands with a raw command bark and threw them into the backs and flanks of the Iron Warriors inside the mausoleum, not to retake it, but to hold the press in place for moments more. It became a butcher's knot of grappling ceramite and point-blank detonations. One Iron Hand locked both arms around a traitor sergeant and walked him backward into an exposed plasma feed. They vanished together in a bloom of blue-white fire that painted the ceiling in gobbets of vaporized meat and cooling armor droplets. Forixon saw the sarcophagus too late. He turned from Kadron and roared for his warriors to cut toward the transit spur. But the chamber had fallen fully into machine madness. Contradictory command strings still shrieked through every active system. Automata woke in the side alcoves and fired into the nearest motion. A servitor battery mounted high in the wall suddenly acquired the Iron Warriors as hostile and stitched explosive rounds into their own advance wedge. The floor shifted under a partial bastion realignment and swallowed a whole knot of legionaries into a grinding seam. Kadron used that heartbeat of disorder well. He hurled himself at Forixon again, not to kill him, but to anchor him in place for the final necessary span. The warsmith beat him back with crushing blows, but every second their weapons were locked was another second Morvek dragged the relic closer to escape. They reached the magma transit cannon as the upper citadel gave way above them. The sound came through the stone like the death of a continent. Whole sections of Hexian Crown were collapsing under shellfire, misaligned walls, detonating power relays, and the uncontrolled rage of the severed archive. Dust and sparks blasted through the transit galleries. The cannon chamber itself shook as ancient heat shields irised open over a long armored barrel descending into red darkness. Emergency launch shrines flickered alive in response to Hest's stolen protocols. Morvek heaved the sarcophagus into the waiting armored coffin torpedo cradle with the last strength in his failing frame. Locks snapped around it. Shield shutters closed. Launch runes glowed. Behind them, the chamber mouth filled with smoke, traitors, and the pulse flash of gunfire. Kadron keyed open the command line to the Ferrum Absolved and heard only static, half a prayer, then a scarred bridge officer's voice breaking through the interference. Strike cruiser receiving. Transit solution unstable. Receive it anyway, Kadron said. He looked once at Morvek, once at the dying transit chamber, once at the red-lit coffin containing the thing for which they had spent a world. Then he struck the launch sigil. The armored torpedo roared into the magma transit cannon and vanished upward through the buried shaft toward the waiting void, even as Hexian Crown died around them and the tomb of the old machine warmind collapsed into final ruin. The launch of the coffin torpedo did not end the battle. It only gave all remaining life on Cardane's grave a final shape for its dying. The armored shell vanished into the red throat of the magma transit cannon with a roar like a forge world exhaling its last breath. For one heartbeat, the launch chamber blazed white, all shadows erased by the violence of the ignition. Then the light was gone. The recoil thunder rolled out through the transit galleries, and the whole eastern spur of the deepest vault shook as if struck by a god's fist. Ancient armored shutters tore loose from their tracks. Heat shields split. Dust, sparks, and powdered shrinestone fell in sheets. Somewhere far above, the transit shaft punched upward through kilometre after kilometre of dead industry and ruptured machine catacombs, bearing the sealed cognition core toward a void that was itself full of fire. Then the Iron Warriors came on in full. Damek Forixon saw the launch flare and understood immediately that something irreplaceable had left his grasp. He did not waste breath on fury. Fury was expenditure. He redirected it into annihilation. Kill everything, he said. There was no grand oratory in the order, no curse upon the Emperor, no invocation to bitter gods. His warriors did not need any. They surged into the transit chamber with the hard certainty of a wall finally giving way beneath the ram. Bolters barked in the smoke. Breacher shields slammed against broken shrine bases. Chain blades carved orange arcs through ash-filled air. The chamber floor, already slick with blood and black oil, became almost unwalkable beneath the crush of dead. The spill of molten conduit metal and the chunks of shattered machine altars falling from above. Kadron Voss met the first rush after the launch, half blinded and half broken. Forixon's last blow in the mausoleum had caved in one side of his helm and ruptured the shoulder seal of his armor. Blood ran down inside his gorget and over the cable bundles at his neck. Warning runes must have been screaming through his internal display, but no living warrior of the Iron Hands obeyed the complaints of the flesh when there was still function to be extracted from it. He fought in the mouth of the transit chamber with his axe and his pistol, killing to buy nothing more glorious than obstruction. An Iron Warrior breacher came at him with a shield and a short-barreled melter. Kadron shot him through the eye slit. Another struck from the side and buried a chain blade into Kadron's abdomen seam. The Iron Father seized the weapon arm, tore the blade deeper through his own ruined plating to close the distance, and split the traitor's head open down to the tongue. He kicked the collapsing corpse into the next wave and fired over it until the pistol clicked dry. He did not think of the relic anymore. That part of his labor had been discharged. What remained was denial, delay, the same pure calculus that had governed every choice since the first signal called them here. Routh Drake bled that same calculus into the stones one corridor back. He had been dying since the threshold fell, but dying did not always mean ceasing. He had a hole burned through one side of his torso that should have dropped even an Astartes into final stillness. One arm hung ruined and almost severed. Half his face was visible through the remains of his helm, the flesh beneath grey with shock and black with dried blood. Yet he still stood in the vault mouth where the chamber fed into the shattered descent, and he killed with a stubbornness stripped beyond anger. The corridor there had become too narrow for clean maneuver. Broken wall plates and the carcasses of combat servitors reduced it to a jagged throat clogged with bodies. Iron warriors trying to force through had to climb over their own dead and the dead of the Iron Hands alike, and Routh used every inch of that obstruction like a siege master turning rubble into fortification. He killed one traitor with a thrust under the chin that sent the blade up through the brain and out the crown of the helm. He tore the weapon free, fired his bolt, pistol point blank into another warrior's breastplate until the mass reactive shell exploded through the spine, then used the falling body as a step to hurl himself into the next pair. Ceramite crashed into ceramite. The corridor vanished into snarling breath, oil spray, sparks, and the intimate wet crack of blade meeting flesh under armor. An Iron Warrior drove a combat knife through Routh's ruined side and twisted. Routh ignored it and headbutted him so hard the traitor's visor imploded inward. Another hacked at Routh's knee joint with a chain axe. Teeth bit metal. Warning lights stuttered. Routh stamped down on the attacker's wrist until bone and gauntlet collapsed together, then buried his own blade through the neck ring and ripped sideways. He was not fighting to win. He knew that. They all knew it. He was fighting to leave a shape in the corridor that would delay the next advance by seconds. Those seconds had become the only currency left worth spending. Phoryxons, veterans, finally reached him through the jam of corpses and slagged plating. They came not in some noble ring of champions, but as butchers entering a pen too tight for clean killing. One fired low and blew chunks from Routh's thigh. Another slammed a shield edge into his wounded side and drove him against the wall. A third went for his throat. Routh killed that one first, grabbing the traitor's weapon arm, wrenching it aside, and biting the broken edge of his own helm into the exposed face beneath with enough force to tear nose, lips, and one eye into a burst of meat. Then the others piled onto him. Routh still killed one more. He trapped a breacher close enough to smell the old oil and cordite in the traitor's armor seals, locked his good arm around the warrior's neck, and dragged him backward into a live power conduit hanging from the ruined wall. Both of them vanished in a burst of white-blue discharge. The breacher died instantly, flesh boiling inside his armor. Routh somehow remained standing long enough to wrench himself free, skin and blackened tissue sloughing from the exposed side of his face. When the final shots hit him, they came from point-blank range. He went down at last beneath the threshold he had held, and he died there exactly as the war had demanded, leaving the entrance choked with smashed ceramite, cooling oil, and enough blood to make the stone shine. Farther inside, Morvek became the gate. No living iron hand remained strong enough to move him. No living iron hand remained sane enough to ask him to withdraw. His ruined chassis lay half across a breach corridor leading from the transit spur back into the mausoleum approaches, one arm locked around a collapsed support rib, the other reduced to cracked adamant talons and exposed pistons. Almost his entire left side was gone. One optic burned dimly. The sarcophagus that held what remained of his body was split open in 3 places, revealing the armoured coffin within like a second wound nested inside the first. A surviving surf officer, dragged below to carry ammunition and now more blood than man, crawled near enough to scream through his shredded throat grill. "Ancient, evacuation route identified." Morvek answered without turning. "Negative." The serf, perhaps from shock, tried again. "You will be buried." "I was buried long ago." Then the first Iron Warrior push hit his corridor. Morvek fired nothing. He had nothing left to fire. He killed with mass, pistons, and the simple refusal of his bulk to move. The first traitor to try climbing over him had his chest crushed between Morvek's remaining claw and the deck until ribs punched out through his back in white-red splinters. The second was seized by the ankle and beaten against the wall hard enough to shed limbs. A shield servitor tried to wedge through the gap beside him. Morvek pinned it against the stone and ground until shield, servitor, and the meat packed inside it became one flattened paste leaking hydraulic fluid. Rounds hammered him. Plasma scorched him. Melter bloom opened fresh rents in his ruined shell. Still he held the corridor. His body, broken beyond any sane engineering, remained an obstacle no ordinary flesh could have reproduced. Organic warriors would have failed minutes earlier. Morvek fought on because function remained, and function was all that mattered. Above them all, the coffin torpedo climbed. It punched through collapsing industrial strata like a round fired through diseased bone. Transit shafts cracked open around it. Conveyor tombs burst as its passage shock tore through dead rails and ancient machine gantries. Dormant servitor vaults were ripped apart in its wake, their sealed occupants spilling into magma-lit voids as the armoured shell screamed upward under its own acceleration and the desperate geometry keyed into it by Hestval's final protocols. In the higher strata, it broke through a manufacturum cathedral already, shearing apart under random fortress fire, flinging red-hot stone and dead machine saints into the air. It crossed through the upper atmosphere of Cardane's grave inside a sheath of incandescent debris and rising vapour, a coffin shell carrying a forbidden warmind toward the last waiting hand. The last surviving Iron Hand's strike cruiser in low orbit received it under fire. The Ferrum Absolved no longer resembled a warship fit for battle. It was a wounded blade staggering through void smoke. Whole weapon decks were gone. Portside armour hung open in slabs. Fires burned in sections vented to vacuum and only barely sealed by emergency field veils. Around it drifted the broken bodies of escorts, and the glittering wreckage of a fleet bled white by the Void War. Yet the strike cruiser held its place in the dying orbit because it had not been permitted to leave before the mission's function was complete. On the bridge officers hardwired into bleeding thrones screamed target, solutions and damage tallies while the machine spirit howled through failing relays. Then the incoming rune changed from uncertain to blessedly real. Coffin torpedo on approach. Recover. Recovery cradles damaged. Recover with claws then. Mag-locked retrieval grapples punched out from the strike cruiser's wounded hull. The torpedo struck the first one hard enough to shear 2 clamps loose into space. The second and third held. The armoured shell was dragged inward through fire and spinning debris, while point defence batteries still snapped at Iron Warrior's pursuit craft, clawing upward from the planet below. On Cardane's grave, Gul Kaza felt the launch path complete and at last understood the Loyalist design. He stood amid the ruins of the node crypt, half his remaining mechadendrites fused and his robe hanging in scorched strips. Around him, the dead priest brains that had failed to bind the relic sagged in their baths like burst fruit. Tactical feeds from the mausoleum and transit routes painted the truth too clearly to deny. They never meant to hold, he said. A nearby thrall, missing most of his jaw and still trying to relay casualty scrolls, stared upward in confusion. Kaza struck him dead with an impatient backhand of iron. They never meant to keep the world, he growled, to himself more than anyone. Only to make us buy the shell while the core escaped. Every corridor, every counterstrike, every dead brother of theirs. Delay. Nothing but delay. He voxed Forixon at once, but the Warsmith had already drawn the same conclusion and had already judged it within the hard law of his legion. Because on the surface and in the vaults alike, the Iron Warriors had won. Hexian crown belonged to them absolutely now. The upper citadel had fallen. The last Loyalist gun nests were being reduced room by room, shrine by shrine, transit hall by transit hall. Iron Warriors legionaries butchered through the remaining. Iron Hands pockets without nobility and without pause. No quarter was offered. No speeches were exchanged. In one shattered relay chapel, a lone Iron Hands brother with both legs missing kept firing from behind a toppled altar until a traitor squad filled him with bolts and then hacked the gene seed from his chest just to desecrate the corpse. In another chamber, 3 Iron Hands attempted a final countercharge through the smoke of a burning cogitator bank. They were met by breacher shields, pinned against the wall, and cut apart at the joints like meat hung in a slaughter room. Forixon walked through it all and measured victory by possession. The outer walls were his, the gun crowns were his, the bastion's corpse was his. The archive complex beneath it, physically seized and cleared of organized resistance, was his. The enemy was broken, reduced to isolated kill pockets and dead men with guns still locked in rigor. Therefore, the war was won. That was the Iron Warrior's truth. Not elegance, not purity, not some false ideal of moral right. Ground taken, enemy annihilated, fortress possessed. The rest was complaint for weaker minds. He entered the archive mausoleum through smoke, corpse mounds and the wrecks of malfunctioning automata still twitching on the floor. Cadron was there still, barely. The Iron Father had made it no farther than the outer edge of the transit spur before his body began to admit what it had lost. He lay seated against a shattered shrine column, one hand still wrapped around his axe, the other pressed instinctively against the ruin of his abdomen, as though pressure alone could command the organs to remain inside. One side of his helm had been torn away. His remaining eye was open. Blood sheeted down his armor and pooled beneath him. Even so, when Forixon approached, Cadron tried to rise. He failed only because his body could no longer answer. Forixon looked at him for a long second, then looked past him to the severed cradle. The central suspension frame still hung there, empty now, its collars spread, its interface trunks burned and dripping. The receiving altars were gutted, The chamber floor was coated with black residue, scorched sacred oils, and the cooked remains of Magos Hestval. Enough of the cradle logic remained intact for a skilled eye to see exactly what had been done. Something had been cut out. Something had been taken. Around the empty shell, his warriors searched in widening circles, overturning dead, ripping open side crypts, blasting into alcoves that had never held anything but ancient dust. It was meaningless. The answer sat before them in the shape of the absence. Forixon stepped closer to the cradle, studying the burn marks around the severance points. "Hard extraction," he said. Kaza's damaged voice crackled over the link. "Portable, shielded. I can read the residue. The main architecture is gone." Forixon's jaw tightened by a degree no more visible than a fault line forming in stone. The prize escaped. Yes. All around him, his legion held the dead heart of the fortress. All around him, the symbols of victory were undeniable. But the one thing beneath the whole war, the true engine of all the blood and shell expenditure, had been denied. He turned back to Kadron. The Iron Father's breaths were wet and shallow now. He should not have been conscious. He was, because will and doctrine were refusing his body permission to stop before one final datum arrived. Forixon understood that too. He lifted his weapon, not quite pointing it, and said, "You bought ruin and call it success." Kadron's remaining eye found him through blood and smoke. His voice came rough through a ruined grill. "You won the stone." He coughed black into his gorget, then forced the rest out. "We took the hand from the throat." The warsmith stared at him. He could have killed him then. It would have been easy. It would even have been proper in some colder arithmetic. But the need for execution had already diminished. Kadron Voss was mortally opened. His death was a process already in motion. A vox burst crackled at Kadron's collar, so faint that at first it sounded like static. Then the signal resolved into the wounded voice of the Ferrum-absolved's bridgemaster. "Recovery confirmed. Sarcophagus received aboard. Repeat. Sarcophagus received aboard." Kadron closed his eye. Forixon saw the exact instant the loyalist permitted himself that knowledge. Not joy, not triumph, only the cold completion of labor. When Kadron opened the eye again, the light in it had become thinner. "Now," he whispered, "the world can die." Whether he lived another minute or another hour after that did not matter to the war. He had survived long enough to hear what he needed. Above Cardane's grave, the last Iron Hands vessels began to withdraw. They did not flee cleanly. They limped. Fires still burned across, their hulls. One escort frigate rolled off the withdrawal line and broke apart under fresh macro fire before it could clear the gravity well. The Ferrum absolved itself, took 2 more hits across its already ruined stern as it clawed away from low orbit, trailing plasma and atmosphere like blood from a severed artery. Yet it climbed. It turned its broken prow toward the dark beyond the system and carried the sealed cognition core with it. On the surface, under black skies torn by random fortress fire and the last convulsions of the dead machine world, the Iron Warriors stood triumphant atop Hexion Crown. Their banners flew over the broken walls. Their artillery dominated the horizon. Their armored columns crawled through the corpse-packed plazas and burned hive districts of a world they had beaten into ownership. Slave gangs already moved through the rubble under guard, dragging bodies into heaps, stripping armor from the dead, and marking salvage zones in the ashes. By every law, the 4th Legion recognized the campaign had ended in absolute victory, and still the truth remained. The true prize was gone. Phoryxon stood upon the ruined upper battlements of Hexion Crown and watched the distant flare of the Iron Hand's fleet dwindling into the black, its ships limping, burning, wounded almost beyond function. Behind him lay a conquered world. Beneath him lay the gutted archive. Around him, the guns of his legion thundered in triumph over a dead planet. Yet somewhere inside that withdrawing wreck of a strike cruiser, sealed in darkness and adamant, the forbidden mind they had come to claim was leaving his grasp. The world belonged to him. The relic did not. Cardane's grave did not know peace after the battle. It knew ownership. The guns did not fall silent when Hexion Crown was taken. They changed their language. Bombardment gave way to execution fire, to demolition barrages against districts deemed structurally useless, to ranging salvos that marked fresh slave roads and cleared the ruins for salvage columns. Smoke still boiled from the broken bastions. Reactor storms still walked the horizon in green processions. In the hive wounds and forge plains beyond the Crown, the surviving population was dragged from vault barracks, transit crypts, and half-collapsed hab tiers by chain gangs and overseer squads, collar-locked and branded into new labour hierarchies before the ash had settled over the dead. The Iron Warriors were thorough in victory because victory without exploitation was waste. Across the Manufactoria belts, surviving macro forges were entered under armed guard and immediately partitioned by utility. Engines that could be restored were tagged for seizure. Engines too ruined to restore were stripped for sacred metals, motive assemblies, and reactor hearts. Data vaults were broken open by siege servitors and copied into chained archive shrines, even when the files inside were fragmentary or corrupted beyond direct use. Macro, artillery trains abandoned in the battle zones were hauled upright, their dead crews dumped into rendering pits while fresh slave complements were driven beneath the loading rails. Conveyor necropoli were reactivated to move salvage and corpses alike. Old machine chapels that had once sung with forbidden logic now echoed to the barked orders of the 4th Legion and the wet coughs of labourers dragged too quickly back into purpose after years or centuries of dormancy. Cardane's grave had become what the Iron Warriors always made of conquered worlds. A workshop built from agony. Phoryxon stood above that workshop on the torn crown of the upper citadel and addressed his legion beneath a sky blackened by soot and random fortress discharge. The plaza below him had once served as a command court for forge kings and machine priests. Now its statues were headless, and its paving stones drowned beneath shell craters, slave blood, and wreckage from the fighting. Iron Warriors legionaries stood in ranked lines amid that ruin, armour blackened, pitted, and streaked with old gore. Around them clanked siege servitors, macro gun crews, chain handlers, demon engine wardens, and the first of the new slave musters. Above them, the banner of the 4th Legion snapped in a hot ash wind from the broken battlements of Hexion Crown. Phoryxon spoke not like a priest or a tyrant savouring adoration, but like a siege engineer delivering the conclusion of a completed calculation. "The enemy is broken," he said. "The ground is ours, the fortress is ours, the world is ours. The guns of Cardane answer to our hand. Its forges answer to our need. Its dead answer to our arithmetic, and its living to our chain. This campaign stands complete." There was no need for grander flourish. Among the Iron Warriors, the one who remained standing on the ruins was the one who had won. That was law enough. His warriors answered with a hard thunder of weapon butts on stone, shield edges on deck, plating, and the bark of short, mirthless laughter from men who had bought victory at a price they deemed acceptable because they were the ones still drawing breath. Siege salvos rolled from the captured gun crowns at that same moment, firing not into necessity, but into proclamation. The horizon shook with each report. Slave columns flinched. Old walls shed more stone into the plazas below. The guns spoke the Legion's triumph in a language every world understood. Publicly, the campaign was perfect. Privately, Forixon knew the wound at its center. He descended later into the gutted archive mausoleum with only his chosen guard and Gul Kaza limping at his side, the warpsmith wrapped in scorched robes stiff with dried blood and machine fluids. The chamber smelled of cooked metal, burnt cognition gel, and the old bitter incense of Mechanicus rites, interrupted by slaughter. Dead iron hands still lay where they had bought the last minutes of denial. Dead iron warriors lay among them, stripped already where practical by servitors and picked over for genocode, weapon cores, and any recoverable augmetic worth. The shrine columns were wrecked. The automata alcoves were split open and blackened. At the center hung the severed cradle and the burned interface trunks, where the cognition core had once nested like a poison heart. Forixon stared at the empty architecture in silence. It was not ignorance that sharpened his contempt. It was understanding. He could read the violence of the extraction in the scars on the machine housings, the brutal utility of it in the gouge marks around the cradle locks, the certainty of loyalist intent in the way the sacrificial positions around the chamber had been arranged. Kadron had never meant to preserve the world. He had meant to spend it. Every corridor, every reserve transfer, every counterstrike launched not to reclaim, but to delay. Every battle brother chained into a firing line or left to die holding a threshold. It had all purchased one outcome. The core was gone. All that remained was a mutilated shell and a world made unstable by its removal. Gul Kaza moved among the dead altars with the stiff care of a wounded predator, his surviving mechadendrites probing through ash and burned logic residue. Occasionally, one would find some shard of blackened code crystal or a section of interface spine not wholly destroyed. Those he took and stored in reliquary canisters borne by crawling thralls. Forixon watched him and said, "You salvage scraps from a corpse." Kaza clicked his brass teeth together in what might have been amusement. A corpse remembers. Scrap remembers. Fragments rot in fruitful ways when fed correctly. The principal mind is gone. Yes. Kaza crouched over a broken shrine and peeled back a scorched plate, revealing layers of old logic wafers fused by heat. But a severed hand can still teach the shape of a grip. A burned prayer can still speak if one listens. Through the smoke. We lost the central architecture. That is true. Yet defeat has its own harvest. Enough residue survives to hint at the command grammars. Enough node scar remains to suggest the bones of the thing. Forixon's eyes hardened. Suggestion is not possession. No, Kaza admitted, but heresy grows well in suggestion. Given years, perhaps decades, perhaps more, I may coax something from what was left behind. Not the relic as it was. Something uglier. Something ours. That earned him no praise, but neither did Forixon order the fragments cast aside. Among the 4th Legion, utility could redeem almost anything but failure unmined. Still, when the warsmith looked again at the empty cradle, he felt the strategic absence of the lost cognition core like phantom pain in a severed limb. The world was his, the true weapon was not. Far above the dead Forge world, aboard the crippled strike cruiser Ferrum Absolved, there was no triumph to answer the iron. Warriors' salvos below. The ship limped through the dark beyond low orbit under emergency power and battle prayer. Its corridors lit by half-functioning lumen strips and the baleful glow of damage runes bleeding from wall shrines. Deck crews worked in silence or in pain, muted by discipline. Fires had been contained, but not quenched in several sealed sections. Atmosphere still leaked in places where patch fields whined over ragged hull breaches. The machine spirit did not purr. It endured, wounded and angry, a caged thing forced to live because greater labor remained unfinished. Kadron Voss survived within that wounded shell by the same logic. He lay not in comfort, but in a surgical alcove whose drain channels ran black with blood and sacred oils. His armor had been cut away where possible, and left in place where removing it would kill him faster than his wounds were already trying to. His abdomen was a bandaged ruin over hastily sealed augmetic braces and clotting chem meshes. One side of his face was gone beneath a lattice of temporary iron and cauterized flesh. His remaining eye burned with feverish light that never softened into weakness. A chain of med servitors worked over him with precise brutality, amputating what could not be saved, replacing what function demanded, discarding what neither could justify. He waved away pain suppressants strong enough to dull his thought. "Not until the protocols are spoken," he said. The sealed sarcophagus had been taken to the ship's deepest hold, a chamber once meant for sacred war relics, and now reduced to a black vault wrapped in emergency shield layers. Around it stood triple rings of sanctification. First came the iron warding chains, every link engraved with Binharic cants of obedience and denial. Then came the null insulation housings, scavenged from damaged astropathic screens, and reworked into a coffin cage around the relic's own armored shell. Last came the human line, not because Kadron trusted flesh, but because flesh could be executed more readily than machines if compromise occurred. Veteran Iron Hands stood watch in silence beside execution servitors armed with Volkite chargers and sanctioned cutter arrays. Kadron was wheeled there on a steel bier, still bleeding through his dressings, because no lesser command voice would suffice. The survivors gathered around him were all marked by the battle. One had lost both hands and now bore provisional augmetic clamps. Another had half his jaw replaced with a field-fitted steel brace. Apothecaries stood with gene seed canisters chained to their armor. Bondsmen with slates and slate knives waited at the edge of the chamber to record the words that would doom them if they ever repeated them outside the proper seal. Kadron looked at the sarcophagus and spoke in a voice scraped raw, but still cold enough to freeze the room. This relic is sealed under triple sanctification. No study without command sanction. No transit without command sanction. No interface, probe, invocation, machine communion, or doctrinal review without command sanction. Any who attempt access beyond this order are to be put to death immediately. Any who voice its deeper nature without leave are to be put to death immediately. Any who permit its compromise through error, curiosity, fear, or faith are to be put to death immediately. He turned his eye toward the officers, the apothecaries, the servitors, the bondsmen. This order is permanent. No one objected. No one sought some gentler codicil. They were Iron Hands. The price had already been paid. Only fools softened what blood had bought. When the formal commands were entered and locked, Kadron remained a moment longer before the black shape in its cage of iron and warding. Through the deck, he could feel the machine spirits of the ship whispering in agitation. The relic did not speak in any voice comprehensible to unaugmented ears, yet all present sensed the pressure of it. A held thought, a bound calculation, something old enough to despise being caged. Kadron understood then, more fully than he had on the world below, what they had preserved. Not hope, not salvation, a weapon, worse than a weapon, a principle of war entombed in hard logic, capable of turning walls into mines and battlefields into equations that discarded men like shell casings. He had denied it to the Iron Warriors. That was true. Yet denial did not make it holy. Loyalist hands were still hands. Transhuman minds were still minds. Weakness wore many uniforms. He felt something like bitterness pass through him, not because the decision had been wrong, but because it might only have shifted the danger to another place and another day. By saving it, he might have preserved a thing no hand should ever close around. Elsewhere aboard the Ferrum Absolved, the surviving Iron Hands did what survivors of their chapter always did. They counted. They counted the dead by clan, by battlefield, function, by recoverable gene seed, by armor salvage, by augmetic value, by doctrinal significance. They counted the living by degree of usability. Those too broken to return to duty, but sound enough to endure further service, were marked for amputation, entombment consideration, or hard labour in the service decks. Those too, ruined even for that, were euthanized without ceremony after their final gene seed harvest. Apothecaries moved among the wounded with nartheciums hissing, drawing the future of the chapter from brothers whose present had already ended. Tech Marines and Med Servitors sawed off limbs crushed beyond restoration and replaced them with temporary iron frameworks that hissed with every motion. The dead were classified not as heroes, but by remaining utility. Armor to be stripped, bionics to be reclaimed, names to be entered into iron memory if function had warranted remembrance. There was no celebration because celebration implied some excess of life. What remained on the ship was merely what the war had not yet managed to consume. Morvek's command rune stayed lit longer than anyone expected. His broken dreadnought frame remained somewhere beneath the buried ruin of Cardane's grave, in the breach corridor where he had made himself into a gate. Telemetry linked through old command channels flickered in and out as the world below convulsed, but enough remained to tell the story without embellishment. Motion, impact, power loss, weapon stubs dead, one arm still cycling, another structural collapse, more impacts, more loss. Still, the rune remained. Brothers passing the casualty altar paused before it, not in sentimental grief, but in recognition. He had continued until continuation ended. At last, during the black span between one damage alarm and the next, the rune dimmed from active red to the flat grey of concluded service. No one spoke at first. Then an old Iron Hands veteran missing half his throat said to the apothecary beside him, "He endured." The apothecary sealed another gene seed vial and answered, "That is all immortality is." And among the sons of Medusa, that was enough. Morvek had not needed rescue. He had not needed witness. His final service had been complete. The body, already surrendered long ago, had at last exhausted its use. Duty had outlived flesh, then machinery, then even the hope of recovery. Only function mattered, only completion. In that sense, he had not diminished at all. Kadron heard of Morvek's silence while drifting on the edge of surgical shock and command wakefulness. He gave no outward sign beyond closing his eye for a single measured breath. Then he ordered the ancient's name entered into the iron rolls without embellishment. No false poetry, no feverish saga, simply the truth of service rendered to conclusion. Below them, Cardane's grave settled into its new reality. The Iron Warriors chained the citadels and called it order. Fresh trenches were dug through old, plazas and corpse fields alike. Slave columns marched beneath whipcrack and gun muzzle into the expanding salvage belts, dragging carts full of stripped armour, machine parts, and the bones of the dead. Captured macro guns fired victory salvos at measured intervals across the ash horizon. Not because targets remained to be destroyed, but because the repeated thunder reminded the living who now commanded the guns. In the Manufactoria districts, overseers drove surviving labour stock back into assembly ruins, already being converted into crude but functional forges for the production of shells, chains, spare track sections, and the endless iron needs of a legion that believed every conquered world existed to feed the next war. The banner of the 4th Legion flew over broken towers, over cratered processional roads, over the dead heart of Hexian Crown itself. It was a vision of pure Iron Warriors' triumph, not beauty, not restoration. Domination expressed through utility and ruin. Far above, in the hold of the Ferrum Absolved, the sealed sarcophagus rested in darkness behind its triple sanctification. The machine spirits around it whispered through the hull in uneasy, almost fearful static. Outside the hold, wounded survivors limped through scarred corridors, iron replacing flesh in bloody increments, while bondsmen scrubbed the deck drains clear of the chapter's own leaking remains. No one on that ship spoke of victory. They had escaped with the relic. They had denied the enemy. They had also lost brothers, ships, gene seed, worlds of labour, and perhaps something less measurable. Certainty, perhaps, or the ability to pretend that what they had saved was anything but a delayed catastrophe. Cadron, still alive because command had not yet dismissed him, lay in shadow and contemplated the sealed core with the merciless honesty of his kind. He had not saved hope. He had ensured only that the war would continue somewhere else, around some other fortress, above some other grave, when another hand decided the thing in the sarcophagus was worth awakening again. That was the final truth of Cardane's grave. On the world below, citadels in chains, guns proclaiming conquest, slave columns vanishing into fresh trenches, and the banner of the 4th Legion over an ash-choked horizon. Above, a dark hold, a sealed sarcophagus whispering to itself through iron and warding, and a handful of survivors who understood that all they had carried away from the dead world was not salvation, but the promise of another war.